The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Order. Helen Jones to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Wilson. It's a great pleasure to be here under your chairmanship this afternoon. And I beg to move that the House has considered the 3 petitions on the order paper, all of which relate to the BBC. One of those petitions calls for a public inquiry into what the signatories perceive as bias in the BBC. One calls for the abolition of the licence fee, and the third is about the restoration of free TV licences for the over 75s. As we have previously debated the licence fee, and with it a number of accusations of bias in this chamber, I don't propose to spend too much time on it this afternoon because there are lots of people wanting to speak. However, let me say very clearly, as Harold Wilson said about public inquiries, they take minutes and last for years and seldom solve anything, certainly nothing as subjective as that. While I think that the BBC does sometimes get things wrong, as any organisation does, I do not believe that it is inherently biased in its news and current affairs coverage. Indeed, we ought to remember that the BBC's news coverage is looked at round the world as a beacon of straightforward, unbiased news reporting, and we ought to be proud of that as a country. If it has a bias, it's probably towards London, as those of us who have sat through items about London stations on the national news will know, and it does not reflect the regions and nations of this country well. But the reason it is... I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Old lady for giving way. She just said that we ought to be proud of it. Would she acknowledge that, in fact, as a country, we are very proud of the BBC, that not only is it one of the most popular institutions in this country, but it's one of the institutions that gives this country most credit around the world, and whatever mistakes it make, I think they should be framed in that overall attitude.
I agree with the Honourable Gentleman. The reason for that is that we maintain the model of public service broadcasting. And those who want to get rid of the licence fee, I think, ought to remember that a public service broadcaster is free of commercial and sponsorship influence in its news, but also provides a far wider range of channels and radio stations than those broadcasters who aim at a niche market. In fact, the BBC has to cater for a whole range of tastes, including minority interests in its output. However, there is no doubting that the decision to end free TV licences for the over 75s and restrict them to those in receipt of pension credit in a moment has hugely damaged the BBC's reputation. It has met with almost universal condemnation. In fact, the only people I could find who were in favour of it were the Taxpayers Alliance, who seem to get a lot of their funding from people who don't pay British tax.
Exactly.
But nevertheless, the real villain of the piece here is not the BBC. It is the government, which in 2017 fought an election on a manifesto which promised to maintain the free TV licences for the duration of this Parliament, knowing full well that it had already entered into an agreement in 2015 with the BBC that made that impossible. I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for my honourable friend for giving way. Does she agree with me that people are rightly outraged about this decision? They voted for the Conservative Party because it had it in their manifesto. Over 4,000 pensioners in Barnsley are due to lose their TV licence, and a huge number have got in touch with me about this.
Yes. My honourable friend is right. And the BBC was very foolish to accept that agreement. But what the government was doing is what we have seen it do so often, which is devolving the blame for its cuts. We've seen this time and time again, haven't we? Particularly in relation to older people. So they say they want a good system of adult social care, but they have consistently cut the funding to councils to pay for it, especially in those areas which are the poorest and which have the longest legacy of industrial diseases and ill health. Once more, then I must make some progress.
Thank you. On that point, haven't we found, actually, through this, that there are many people who are eligible for pension credit but aren't getting it because of the issue that people who are exempted won't have to pay? The 2,936,000 of pension credit isn't being claimed in my constituency. We write to people on the back of the TV licences. Isn't it time that we both fix the BBC but also fix this pension credit issue?
Well, I will be coming on to that point in a moment, which my honourable friends make, and it's a very good point. But let us have a look at how else the government has dealt with these issues. For instance, all those of pension age are entitled to a free bus pass. It was brought in by the Labour government in 2001, extended in 2008 to cover the whole of England, and yet that is currently underfunded to the tune of about £652 million because the government keeps reimbursing people based on 2005 to 6 fares. Now, how long before that goes? I'll give way to my honourable friend, and I must make some progress.
Giving way. We will maintain all of the pensioner benefits, including free bus passes, eye tests, prescriptions and TV licence for the duration of this Parliament. A manifesto promise broken by this government. It's not just letting older people down, it's letting trust in politics down as well.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, because you can see a pattern here, and it's there in the agreement with the BBC. The BBC was to take on the funding of free TV licences as the government gradually withdrew its contribution until they took on the whole of that for 2020-2021. Now, in 2017-18, the cost of those licences was around £655 million. Last year, the government paid from the DWP £468 million. This year, they will pay £247 million. Now, that is an unsustainable funding model, and the government knew this, or at least they ought to have known it. If they didn't know, they're more incompetent than even I think they are, when they entered into that agreement. And to fund it, the BBC would need to close down channels or radio stations. We have seen a number of columnists, I think, talking about the money paid to the top earners at the BBC. Now, I do actually think some of them are grossly overpaid, and it is my view, and it's an entirely subjective view, that some of the so-called talent are not very talented either. But restricting pay to £100,000 top rate would still not meet the cost of these licences. Now, the government, again, must have known this. What they're after is deflecting the blame. They knew that if they tried to amend or abolish the scheme, there would be an outcry. So they send it off to the BBC, and then when the changes come in, it's nothing to do with us, mate. They're the not me government, aren't they? The Arthur Dailies of public administration. And yet, in one moment, and yet the decision is theirs, and it will be really damaging to older people in this country. If you can't get out and about and no one visits you, then the TV is your companion. If you cannot afford to go out and socialise, the TV is your entertainment. It's your window on the world. It's a way of keeping your mind active. And that, unfortunately, is the lot of many older people in this country. We do not respect or value our older people in the way that we should. I declare an interest, because I'm heading that way myself, but I will give way to the honourable gentleman before I proceed.
I'm of a generation, Mr Chairman, and the honourable lady will know this, where people used to always say what it says in the BBC, it's the gospel, it's the truth. Does she share my concern that BBC today doesn't have the impartiality that it should have, and there are need to have reforms to instigate to change this perception and go back to the good old days, as we often say, of unbiased reporting on fact and not on personal presenters' opinions?
I don't agree with the honourable gentleman, I'm afraid. I think the BBC produces very good news coverage, and sometimes people see bias when they're actually being told things they don't want to hear, and that's what we must remember. But To return to the lot of older people, if I may. Many of our older people, in fact half of over 75s, are disabled. Age Concern estimates that 3 in 10 of them are living in poverty or just above the poverty line. For these people, TV is a lifeline. And many of them live alone. I have one elderly friend who leaves the TV on almost all the time because it is another voice in a house. She finds that... No, not yet. I need to make some progress. There are lots of people waiting to speak. A house that was once full of people, very active, but is now very silent. To remove free TV licences from people like this is the most mean-spirited of government cuts. It will make lonely people more lonely. We know already that 15% of our older people are lonely, and it will isolate those who are already isolated further. Now, I know it's been argued that restricting free TV licences to those in receipt of pension credit is somehow fairer because they're more deserving. It's very 19th century, isn't it? The deserving and the undeserving. Well, there are several answers to that. The first is, by the time you are 75, you've paid your dues to society, you've worked, you've paid your taxes, many of them have brought up children. Giving people like that a free TV licence is a way of giving something back, a small recognition of their contribution in the past. But the other argument is that although we do need a mix of targeted and universal benefits, as the government is just discovering with this, are much harder to cut. It's a guarantee of continuance most of the time. But all of that argument is based on the myth that there are lots of wealthy pensioners about. And it is just that, it's a myth. There was a lot of publicity given recently to research claiming to show that older people were on average £20 a week better off than those in work. What much of the coverage didn't say is that those figures were taken after housing costs. If you take them before housing costs, then people in work are better off. And yes, many older people do own their own homes outright. For those born between 1945 and 1965, it's about 40%. It's more in the older age groups, of course. But that still leaves a lot of people paying rent. 30% are still paying mortgages. And those who do own their homes outright have foregone other spending to pay for them. What are we at now? A Tory government punishing thrift. And when we had a public consultation on this, the people who came to that made the point very forcibly that older people also have more expenses than younger ones in many areas. For instance, their heating bills are more because they're often at home all day and you feel the cold more. Many of them are paying out for social care. We had one lady whose husband is in a nursing home who's, because of the expense, is seeing her savings disappearing before her eyes. But even those figures, remember, were about median incomes, meaning half of all pensioners are below that level. If we take the Age Concern figures of 3 in 10 over 75s in poverty or just above the poverty line, that is 1.9 million people. 20% of them can't afford to go out and socialise just once a month. 37% can't afford a holiday away from home. And there is another reason for not tying licences to pension credit, and it's simply this. Pension credit uptake has been stuck at 63% for years. That means, as my honourable friend said, that a lot of money is going unclaimed. It's over £4 million in my constituency. Nationally, it's 3.5 billion. That government could have done something about that, of course. It could have had a take-up campaign. It could have simplified the application process. But it hasn't, because it means not only does it save on pension credit, it then saves on the benefits that go along with pension credit. And the second reason for not tying free TV licences to pension credit is that those who will be hit hardest are those who are just above the level for claiming pension credit, who will lose far more of their income than wealthier people. In fact, again, Age Concern estimated that 40% of over 75s either would not be able to afford a TV licence or could only afford it by cutting back on things like food or heating. And those we talked to about this made it very clear that for that generation, they were brought up to pay their bills. They will pay them, even if they have to cut back on something else. And already there are letters dropping through people's doors from the licensing authority a year in advance telling them they will have to pay, causing a real worry to many people. I have to wonder how long it will be before the scammers appear, ringing people up, sending emails, with just checking on your television licence, give us your bank details. It will happen. In fact, I'm told it's already happening in some areas. Now, I have to ask, is that really the kind of country we want to live in, where pensioners go without food to pay for a TV licence or go to jail for not having one? We recently celebrated our D-Day veterans, quite rightly reflecting on the debt the country owes that generation. You do not repay that debt by taking away free television licences. And what will happen to those in care? At the moment, people in care homes get a reduced licence, but the regulations refer specifically to those under 75 because their over 75s were deemed to have a free TV licence. Now, the BBC, of course, probably didn't know this, which brings me to the important question about who should be deciding social policy. I can't think of any way of framing that question that comes up with the answer, the BBC. They are not equipped to do it. They do not have enough information to do it, and they shouldn't be doing it. This is a matter for government and Parliament. Well, since the honourable gentleman's been bobbing up and down, yes.
I thank the honourable lady for giving way, and she's making some very valid points, but I think she's letting the BBC off the hook and acting as an apologist for them. Will she recall that in 2015 on charter renewal, the BBC said they were delighted with the terms of the charter renewal. They were delighted with getting an inflation-linked increase to the licence fee. They were delighted with being let off having to fund the rollout of super-fast broadband, and now they're reneging on our over 75s.
I don't think it is the BBC reneging in this chamber. It is the government reneging on the promises they made to the electorate as recently as 2017. It's as simple as that. And we should actually look at taking back into government the funding of these licences. It will be 740 million by 2020-2021. That sounds a lot, but it's a drop in the ocean compared to most government expenditure and compared to what the candidates for the Conservative leadership are currently offering to spend. Now, the Right Honourable Gentleman for South West Surrey says he will cut corporation tax to 12.5%, one of the lowest in the developed world. The cost of that is £13 billion. The Right Honourable Gentleman for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, I was going to say Henley, but you just move about a lot, says that I apologise to the Honourable Gentleman for Henley. He says he will raise the threshold for the 40% tax. The cost of that is £9 billion. And as the Institute for Fiscal Studies says, most of that benefit will go to the top 10% of earners. Now, I hear those on the government benches saying that this is to protect those on middle incomes. and they need to get real. The median income in this country is not £50,000. It's not even £40,000. Last year, it was £28,400. And that is hugely inflated because incomes at the top end includes large bonuses. So there's a choice, isn't there? Does anyone in this room need a tax cut? We might like one. I'm about to wind up. So we might like one, but we don't need one. There's a choice. Tax is the price you pay for being in a civilised society. Right. Speaking personally, I would rather forego a tax cut and protect our older people properly. I know what side I'm on in this. I know what side my honourable friends are on. In fact, all the opposition parties are on. But the question is for those on the government benches. If they want to stop this happening, and some of them, I think, genuinely do, then they have to pressurise their own ministers to stop this nonsense, take control of the free TV licences, amend the legislation, and look after our older people properly. They should do it because that's what they promised to do. And they should do it because, as my honourable friend for West Bromwich Easter said, you can't means test for loneliness and disability. But actually, most of all, they should do it because it's the right thing to do. They will be judged on whether they keep their promises. And this is one they certainly have not kept. The blame is not with the BBC, who, as I said, were crass to accept this settlement in the first place. The blame lies very firmly with the government.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 234-627, 234-797 and 235-653 relating to the BBC. Now, we've got quite a number of people who want to take part in the debate, and I know we've got 3 hours, but I do want to see it end, for the wind-ups at about 2 minutes to 7. So bearing that in mind, I'm not going to put any time limits on, but consider your colleagues in the room as well. And on that point, I would like to call John Howell.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I suppose that I should start by declaring an interest. For a number of years, I worked as a presenter for the BBC.
My God.
I worked as a presenter for BBC World Service Television, and I presented such well-known programmes as World Business Report and World Business Review, which I'm sure trip off the memory of those that managed to catch it. I was not one of the mega-rich presenters. The Honourable Lady spoke of people in the talented pool who didn't have much talent. I like to think that I did have the talent, but I wasn't paid enough for it. However, it was a wonderful role to have, because you could walk down the street of any high street in the UK and nobody would recognise you. But get off the plane in Delhi and you were mobbed, absolutely mobbed, because that was the distribution of the outcome of the programme. Now, as a presenter there, I was very much aware and made very aware of the editorial policies of the BBC. And I like to think that of all of the programmes that I presented, I didn't infringe those editorial policies at all during my time as a presenter. So I don't think that an accusation of bias on my part would have been either made or appropriate. I fully accept that the BBC is not a perfect organisation. I fully accept that it makes mistakes. But as the Right Honourable Gentleman, who's now no longer in his seat, said, it is an enduring British institution that carries much weight and carries much esteem from people in this country. When I was a presenter there, few would have doubted that it was value for money. I can't recall the value for money issue ever being raised, not once. But if you look at the annual report for the BBC for 2018, It is raised there and is glossed over somewhat. The annual report says that the value for money, based on its survey that it's done of people who watch it, that the value for money ratio was 6 out of 10. It goes on in the very next words to say that is within targets. I think that that's an absurd thing to say. It's an absurd thing to say that you only get 6 out of 10 and yet you still remain in target. There is far more that needs to be done before it can achieve value for money. And I suspect that that value for money argument is influenced by 3 things, principally. First, it's influenced by the news coverage and whether there is an appreciation of bias within that. And I suppose that most of that has come down to whether it is biased in one way or the other in its coverage of Brexit. Personally, I think given the way that Brexit has divided the country, it will be very difficult not to see BBC presenters divided in the same way. The second thing is the range of content. I had a constituent who contacted me to say that he objected to the way in which he was watching a programme on one BBC channel and it suddenly went off and switched to another channel so that they could run, I think it was the tennis from Wimbledon in it. And that is also not an acceptable way of behaving in this. And the third thing is the argument that there has been about salaries and about the gender pay gap. But if you go back a few years to 2013-14, that annual report asked for a reduction in the overall cost of talent. I cannot see any appreciable change that has taken place in the years between the 13 and 14 report and the current year. I can't see any substantial change. I happen to know that the Director General is working on this, but it's something that we need to see progress on pretty quickly. Now, if you look at the range of content, which was one of the arguments that I suspect may have been used by people to justify value for money, there are two programmes that I would point out for this. The first is The Bodyguard, which I thought was a fantastic programme that was of interest to all of us in this chamber, covering the subjects that it does. But it was made by a production company owned by the ITV. And I'll come on to say a little more about that in a minute and about how the nature of the media industry is changing. And secondly, in relation to investigative journalism, I would praise the Panorama programme that covered the issue of anti-Semitism, which I watched from end to end and became more and more disturbed when I watched it. And I noticed that the Honourable Lady said that bias can be seen when we hear what we don't want to hear, and I think that that is a prime example of bias being shown, because it is clearly something that people don't want to hear. But I thought it was a very good programme and one that I will certainly and have recommended to people to watch on iPlayer. Now, I mentioned that The Bodyguard had been produced by an ITV production company, and that illustrates part of the changing nature of the media industry. I remember when I was the chief executive of a production company, I went over to New York to see the foreign editor of Fox. And I said to him, I've come here to sell you some lovely programs that I've made about foreign and interesting places like Mongolia. I was the first journalist into Mongolia to interview the new democratically elected president. And he looked at me and said, "Foreign? You mean California?" Now, that line would not be appropriate today. It would simply not be there today. The world has changed. The media world has completely changed. And we have seen that, that one of the areas in which the BBC competes is online programming, and we've seen them compete fully against Netflix, and we've seen quite a lot of dissatisfaction in working out the value for money score from Netflix. Well, there is also BritBox that is coming online shortly from the ITV. So there is going to be even more competition in this area. And whether in these circumstances the BBC can maintain its position on the licence fee is certainly open to question. But the commercial element in the BBC is not new. We tend to think of the BBC as having no commercial advertising. That is simply wrong. BBC World Service Television carried substantial commercial advertising, and I didn't find that it interrupted the flow of my presenting in the slightest, nor, I think, did any viewers find it interrupted their enjoyment of the programmes.
Of course. Would my honourable friend also note that Channel 4 is a public service broadcaster, but it is not in receipt at any of the licence fee and is funded itself from advertising completely?
I thank him for that comment. I think that the idea of trying to keep out commercial advertising is something that was fine for 50 years ago, fine for even 20 years ago. But in today's world, it needs to be looked at again in the context of how the BBC is going to function. I was going to say a few things on free TV licences, but the Honourable Lady has said quite a lot of them on them.
Do you agree with that?
So I'm not going to. I'm not going to comment on them.
That's what we want to know.
My honourable friend says, "Do I do right?" Oh, sorry, my right honourable friend says, "Do I agree with her?" I think that this is a fault of both the government and of the BBC. And I have told the Director General that. He happens to be a constituent of mine. And I have told him that, and that's the position that I will take on that. That is not sitting on the fence. It is just before my right honourable friend comes in with a witty comment about that. It is a position that I fully hold, and that I think has done the BBC no good at all in the way that it has gone about dealing with the TV licence. Thank you.
Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I recently wrote out to 10,000 constituents asking their thoughts around the free TV licence, and I thought I'd read out some of their replies. I lost my wife in January, and now I spend a lot of time alone. Having the TV on in the background is like having someone with me. I do not know what I would do without it. My husband died 2 years ago. I can't move well enough to leave the house on my own. TV is the only company I have. Why are they going to take it away from me? And Lindsay has dementia and is unable to read or write anymore. TV is vital stimulation, otherwise she sits staring into space. No way could she afford to pay for a licence on a state pension. I will give way.
I thank my friend for giving way so early in his remarks. I just wanted to pick up on that point about dementia. Age UK have said that 850,000 people have dementia in the UK. By 2025 it will be 1 million, many of whom, of course, will be over 75. Isn't the cruelest thing about this the idea that people with dementia might be pursued for payment from the BBC for a TV licence?
You're absolutely right, and I think we've got to think about the most vulnerable in our society that this decision will have an impact on. So letters, emails, phone calls and office visits, the steady stream of correspondence that I received in response to my letter has been in its hundreds. And while each person who contacted me conveyed a heartbreaking account of how they would be affected by this government U-turn, the collective responses that I received are a powerful testament of how important the free TV licence is. We know that in Portsmouth South, from responses that I've received, 300 people got in touch. Nearly 90% supported the continuation of the free TV licence. Nearly 70% cited loneliness as their main concern if the licence were to be revoked. I will give way.
Could I thank my honourable friend for giving me? And his testimony is really very powerful. There are 3,000 households in Blaen and Gwent that could lose their free TV licences under these plans. And crucially, whilst it's a source of entertainment, really very often it's a form of companionship. So does he agree with me that the government should reconsider their decision and restore this important benefit for older people?
Yeah. I thank you for that intervention. I absolutely agree. I think Age UK also said that 4 in 10 people say that the TV is their only company. So there is a social policy that I believe the government should retain. The repercussions of this government decision will not be felt in Whitehall. It is the people in my constituency who will suffer. People in Portsea, Fratton and Southsea. Portsmouth people who I grew up living next to. And Mr Wilson, I believe actions speak louder than words. This government has snatched a vital benefit from a demographic who need it most. Those that are the most vulnerable in our society. Those that owe it to receive something from this government. Only offering a free TV licence to those in receipt of pension credit is an ill-thought-through plan that leaves the door open to injustice. We know that around... I will give way.
I've got a really busy weekend. We've got 2 galas all day long in Lincoln, Booton Park on Saturday and the Arboretum on Sunday, and we had a petition about the TV licences. We were absolutely mobbed with people signing it. It's something that everybody seems to agree about cross-party, and I think there's 4,400 households that would be affected in Lincoln. Do you agree with me that actually it's absolutely, totally and utterly morally wrong to withdraw something so important, particularly when it was an election promise?
Yeah. I think the Honourable Member is absolutely right, and I echo the comments earlier from the Honourable Member around our D-Day veterans. I'm really proud that my grandfather is a D-Day veteran from Southsea. I got into politics because he needed things towards the end of his life, and those services weren't there for him because of austerity. And I think you're absolutely right. This is going to affect so many people in our society. Only offering a free TV licence to those in receipt of pension credit is an ill-thought-through plan, as I mentioned earlier. We know that around 1.3 million over 75s are eligible for pension credit, but do not or cannot claim the benefit. When I met with Age UK in Parliament to discuss this, they informed me that many older people struggle to self-validate that they are in receipt of pension credit. However straightforward the process is, for example, because they are living with some of the loss of cognitive function or chronic illness. This means that those who are most vulnerable are set to lose the most. This policy change means at least 650,000 people of our poorest pensioners are facing a new annual bill they cannot afford. What does the Minister have to say about this silent segment of vulnerable pensioners who have fallen through the cracks in our welfare system and now face further financial turmoil because of a poorly thought-through government policy? And in response to my countless letters and numerous written questions, including a joint letter I wrote with the Portsmouth Pensioners Association to the Prime Minister, I have consistently been told this is a decision that has been made by the BBC. But since when did the broadcasting organisation begin administering welfare? Will Marks and Spencer or Tesco be responsible for delivering universal credit? Should we expect the National Express to begin dishing out free bus passes for the over 75s? The BBC, as a colleague said, is not the DWP. Any attempt made by this government to palm off responsibility is cowardly, unconvincing and spineless. Make no mistake, Mr Wilson, this is a government decision. It is up to us to be the voice of our constituents. My constituents have spoken. The TV licence must remain for the over 75s. I will give way.
But can I press him further on the issue of the BBC, the TV licence? What about the over 75s who want to watch ITV or Channel 4 but have got to, because of the licensing system, pay for the BBC? And isn't it an anachronism that non-payment of the TV tax remains in this country a criminal offence? How can he possibly defend any of that?
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I'm speaking today based on what I'm hearing from my constituents, and the point that you raise has not been raised with the people of Portsmouth. So the arguments could not be more compelling, and I would like to urge the Minister today to be bold and not trot out the usual lines blaming the BBC. We have the opportunity to make a real difference to pensioners' lives. Mr Wilson, this must be taken. A universally free TV licence for over 75s must remain free.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr Wilson. It's a pleasure to appear under your chairmanship, not least because I noticed that the Honourable Member for Stone is speaking in the main chamber, so this is a bit of a safe haven for the next 45 minutes, probably, I estimate. Let me begin, Mr Wilson, by saying that I am an unashamed fan of the BBC, and we keep talking about the TV licence fee, but I think it's worth rehearsing the huge range of services that the BBC provides. I count at least sort of 5 or 6 distinct areas. To begin with what I might call loosely the social aspect of the BBC. It's hard to define, but people forget, for example, the BBC funds 5 classical music orchestras. We could debate whether that's a good use of licence fee payers' money, but there it is. I should begin, by the way, by referring members to my entries in the Register of Members' Interest, because last week, for example, I hosted an event for the BBC where they were launching a new app called Own It, which again is an app designed to help children navigate social media. This week I'm hosting an event with them on a scheme that they're doing with the Arts and Humanities Research Council to fund doctoral students. We, of course, all celebrate the proms when they are launched. So there's a lot that the BBC does that, frankly, no commercial organisation would do, a lot that strays into the area of social good or the work of the Arts Council that the BBC does, that I don't think, frankly, the BBC spends enough time telling people like us what it does in this field. Again, we refer to the TV licence fee and a lot of citations from pensioners talking about how much they love television, but also, let's not forget, radio. The BBC, I think, takes up about 70% of radio listening, and it's not just the national channels that we all listen to, obviously Radio 4 and 5 Live, I suspect, for this demographic, as well as 1, 2 and 3 and 6 Music. But local radio is absolutely vital. In my own constituency, obviously, BBC Radio Oxford, but 39 local radio stations providing vital local coverage, particularly local news coverage. Then, of course, there is BBC News. It's often BBC News that gets the BBC into trouble. Whether you're a Brexiteer, a Remainer, a Corbynista, there's always something for you to get your teeth into to object. But I think, as my honourable friend from Henley, who I had no idea, by the way, had this life as a top-flight media executive, and I thoroughly enjoyed his speech on that. As a star on BBC World, the World Service, the Parliament Channel, local radio news, its website. And I think all of us, again, could agree, however often we disagree at times with how the BBC covers a particular aspect of news, in an era of fake news and in an era of very biased news where we see the effect that's had on politics in the United States, and on an era of fake news being disseminated on social media, how lucky we are to have a, broadly speaking, unbiased and objective and widely respected news service at the heart of the BBC, both here in the UK and abroad. Then, of course, there is BBC Drama and Entertainment, whether it's Strictly Come Dancing or, of course, Poldark, which we all watched last night, or 8 Days, which I watched this morning with my Cavapoo at home. This kind of quality drama, which pervades the whole of the drama output, really, of British television. And one of the reasons why British television is so respected, again, around the world, is because I think the BBC sets a quality anchor, if you like, or a quality level which everyone else aspires to, which I don't think would be there without it. Then there is the BBC's foray into the world of commerce. It does generate its own revenue to keep the licence fee within reason, worldwide, selling its programmes all over the world. BBC Studios making programmes now in profit, and now its foray into commercial television with UK TV, which I shall return to. And finally, all the work it does to make itself
as accessible as possible, not just the iPlayer, which is probably the most user-friendly TV platform, and I would include Netflix in that, but also its work in supporting the rollout of digital radio and its constant innovation in terms of apps, because more and more people obviously access content on smartphones. And as my honourable friend from Henley mentioned, it's BritBox, which is launched in the US with other commercial players and is now potentially launching in the UK. So there's a lot going on in the BBC, and I think it's important for us to remember that. And I always think when people criticise the BBC, they should ask themselves the question, what would we do without the BBC? It is a bit, I have to admit, a bit like the royal family. It's a bit of an anomaly. I'm not sure you'd invent it if you were starting from scratch, but it permeates our culture, and I certainly couldn't imagine a life without the BBC, even though, again, as my honourable friend said, it's not perfect and it gets things wrong. What are the issues that face the BBC? There is obviously the licence fee itself, and we looked at this when we undertook the Charter review, and again, rather like democracy, we concluded that the licence fee is the least worst option of funding the BBC. It maintains a level of independence from government, it gives it a secure income, it still, by and large, works. That is not destined to last forever, and it may well be that the BBC does eventually move to a subscription model. We will have to wait and see. Let's not forget the licence fee itself has evolved. There used to be a radio licence fee that you took out separately from your TV licence. And it may be that there will be debates about whether there is a licence fee aspect to funding the BBC and a subscription aspect. The BBC will continue to try and look at savings. I think it's taken something like £1 billion of costs out of the organisation over the last 10 years, and that is right. It has an existential challenge in terms of competing with the commercial sector. The BBC is a big elephant in the room insofar as the UK media scene is concerned, and you couldn't move 10 years ago for every media organisation, including, funnily enough, The Guardian, complaining about the BBC's reach and scope. That is now dwarfed by the advent of Netflix, or, for example, following Comcast's takeover of Sky and the resources that Sky will have, or indeed Disney. The competition to fund content and the competition for eyeballs, not least in the changing ways people are consuming content, will provide real challenges to the BBC to remain relevant, particularly to a younger demographic, and I don't envy them that. I think the BBC has challenges where it can lead the way. I think one of the things the BBC doesn't do well enough is to ask itself, it focuses far too much, I think, this slightly contradicts what I just said, far too much on how do I compete against ITV or Netflix, and not enough on saying, what does the privilege of a secure income from the licence fee allow me to do for the UK as a whole? And one thing where I don't think the BBC has led... Yes, I give way.
He's giving a very compelling testimony of all the value that BBC adds to this country, and I wholeheartedly endorse everything he said. And he's starting to reach into actually the wider issue, which is about the social value that the BBC adds. So if you're an elderly person suffering from isolation or unable to get out of the house, like my constituent who says, I'm disabled, I can't go out without my carer or my wheelchair, the television is my friend and companion. Doesn't that back up exactly what he said, that the BBC is more about just entertainment? It's adding a social value over and above that.
It certainly is, and if I knew greater depth about the services the BBC provide, I could probably rattle off 5 or 6 other services beyond simply switching on television that I suspect the BBC provides for the Honourable Lady's constituent. But just perhaps this sounds a bit navel-gazing, and I am coming to the conclusion of my remarks. I think the BBC can take a massive lead in diversity, including, for example, with disabled people, but also, obviously, BME people, to support much greater diversity, not just in front of the camera, but behind the camera as well. It really could invest. Not to say that the BBC has not, again, been at the centre of training legions of people who work now across the media over the last 30 or 40 years. But, of course, the issue that really concerns MPs at the moment is the BBC's struggle with having the free TV licence foisted upon it. And as I've said already in the House, this was a policy forced upon it by the government, forced upon it by the Treasury. There was no negotiation. The BBC were going to take the free TV licence whether they liked it or not. As far as the Treasury was concerned, the only room for negotiation was what the BBC could potentially claw back in order to mitigate the financial impact of doing that. It was the wrong decision. It was done because the then government had to meet its manifesto commitment, ironically, of £12 billion in welfare cuts. It was the wrong decision to impose on the BBC. This government has compounded it because, having forced it upon the BBC, it is disgracefully trying to have its cake and eat it by saying it's the BBC's decision, but we disagree with it. If you're going to force it on the BBC, you should support the BBC's decision. If we could roll it back, an honest government would take the policy back from the BBC, engage with the public, and say whether or not free TV licences are affordable. My own personal view, and this is where I will lose the support of those opposite me in the chamber, is that this was a gift given by a previous government without thinking whether it was financially sustainable, and that reform of free TV licences is a perfectly sensible position to look at, and it seems to me that the BBC, after careful analysis, has come up with a sensible policy to reform it. But the question is whether that should be the BBC's role, and the answer to that, Mr Wilson, is no.
Caroline Harris.
Thank you, Mr Wilson, and I thank you for your chairmanship, and I also thank my honourable friend from Warrington North for opening up this debate. 3.6 million older people in the UK live alone, of whom over 2 million are aged 75 and over. And a huge proportion of these individuals rely on the television to alleviate the loneliness that can often come when you live by yourself. Taking away TV licences from the over 75s who are not in receipt of pension credit is going to detrimentally affect people that have worked hard all of their lives. It's going to affect working class areas like my constituency of Swansea East the most. There are over 3,000 households in my constituency that could lose their free TV licence. And this change is going to affect people like my dad, currently under the excellent care of Anglesey Ward in Morrison Hospital, no doubt watching television with his fellow patients. My dad worked hard all his life as a bus driver. He's now 89 years of age, with a small pension and a state pension to live on. He lives alone since my mum passed away, and he relies a lot on his television to ease the common loneliness that occurs when older people live by themselves. He's now going to have to stretch his pension to pay for the TV licence, something that he hadn't planned for. And my dad is just one story that I know will be common across the UK, amongst those who are going to be affected by this change. When the news broke that free TV licence was ended, my neighbours, Merv and Kitty, an elderly couple, immediately called my husband to ask him if it was true that they now had to pay for their licence. Merv's reaction was, stuff 'em, we won't bother putting the TV on. Kitty's was, I can't get out of the house and I really need my TV. Yeah. Therefore, domestics started immediately over whether they keep a TV or they pay the licence. And they've lived all their lives saving for the pension. A small pension, but one that makes them eligible for a free licence. Now, neither my dad nor Kitty and Merv are well off, and they're certainly not rich. Yet they have been treated as such and now face an extra annual cost that is without doubt unfair and unnecessary. At their age, and with the contribution they have made over the many years to this country, a free TV licence is the least that we can give them. Linking the over 75s free TV licence to pension credit is cruel. Pension credit is widely underclaimed by older people, and in Swansea East alone, over £6.5 million of pension credit each year is not reaching the people who were entitled to it. So what about these individuals who won't get their free TV licence because they're either unaware they're entitled to pension credit or for whatever reason have not been able to access pension credit? I've lost the last page. This decision to end the free TV licences for the most vulnerable people is shocking. For the sake of people like my dad, for the people like Kitty and Merv out there, for all our elderly population, the least we can do is show them the respect and give them a free TV licence. Thank you.
particularly wanted to speak in this debate because I'm a fan of the BBC and I value it as a national institution. But I fear that it is being held back by its outdated funding mechanism. So for one of the BBC's own good, I want to outline why I think new avenues of funding do need to be explored. I fear that by seeking to maintain its outdated funding mechanism, the BBC is handing a very big stick to its critics, of which to beat is increasingly hard, especially following its most recent decision about the free TV licence for the over 75s. A television licence designed for a tiny market for TV broadcasting in the 1920s is utterly at odds with the staggering array of live, online and recorded broadcasting market options that are now available, as well as the ever-growing and emerging technologies in the sector as we enter the 2020s. The television licence is very nearly an antique. It is a punitive tax that belongs to the past if the BBC is to survive and thrive as a public service and worldwide entertainment broadcaster into the future. The BBC has an enviable international reputation for excellence, one that we must celebrate in this House and not begrudge. In an opinion poll last year, the BBC rated a staggering 90% was the most trusted news brand in America, beating Fox, CBS, CNN, Bloomberg and others. And in line with that finding from overseas, I wasn't surprised to see that while many hundreds of my constituents signed the petition to abolish the TV licence, barely 100 had signed the petition for an inquiry into alleged bias, as the honourable member who introduced suggested. To have been trained by or gain experience within the BBC is a world-class addition to any broadcaster's or producer's CV, as I'm sure my honourable friend, the member for Henley, knows all too well. All that is good about the BBC needs to be preserved and refreshed. As an institution, we must support it for the important value, in the widest sense of the word value, that the BBC adds to our national life and international soft power, cultural standing and esteem. And it is in that vein, as a friend of the BBC, that I wished it would embrace the possibility of securing alternative funding to its anachronistic and criminalising television licence regime. In the days when the BBC was the only broadcaster available in the UK, the licence would have seemed an obvious choice of funding, but the world has changed. We can receive a greater number of television channels, not just from the UK, but also from overseas. Many people can now record, pause and rewind live TV as part of their subscription. And a significant proportion of people now subscribe to the number of pay TV subscriptions in the UK in quarter 1 2018, totaled 15.1 million in the UK. And the combined number of online subscriptions to either Netflix, Amazon or Now TV was 15.4 million. And this state of affairs, as the IEA has pointed out, actually acts as a perverse incentive to television makers not to make televisions multifunctional. You don't need a television licence to own a phone that could be used to watch your television programmes, but you do need a television licence to own a television that can be used as a phone. And as we enter the 2020s, mobile multifunctional devices are ever more ubiquitous. We cannot uninvent them any more than we could invent the transistor radio that made the old radio licence an unsustainable nonsense, finally leading to its abolition of the radio-only licence in 1971. We need to look at all possible means for financing the BBC that do not involve any of the kinds of archaic household licences for owning an everyday consumer good. Absolutely.
Could he perhaps outline for us how then he proposes that we should fund those channels and programmes which only appeal to minorities and will never attract a commercial sponsor, and how he would fund other aspects of the BBC, like, for instance, the Proms, its classical orchestras and so on?
Well, I'm just about to come on to that. We need to do away with the inspectors and the persecutions attendant which enforce the licence, that mean looking for potential for pay-on-demand digital broadcasting or some form of subscription package, as we see with Sky, Netflix, Virgin and Amazon Prime and others. Or it might mean allowing programme sponsorship and advertising, as we see on most channels like ITV. And of course, Channel 4, as has already been referred to, Channel 4 is a public service broadcaster. And unfortunately, the member was wrong when she said that there's only one channel. Actually, Channel 4 has a number of channels like E4 and others. No, I've already given way to you once. And I'm just going to thank Channel 4 here for taking on the BBC Hit Pottery programme, Stoke-on-Trent's very own Great Pottery Throwdown, following the BBC's unfortunate and frankly wrong decision not to commission a new series for itself. And for programmes in the arts, crafts, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr Wilson. One point I would just level with him is that Channel 4 is a public sector broadcaster, as he's mentioned. It receives subsidies. But Channel 4 actually outbid the BBC with one of its own programmes, being the Great Bake Off. So actually, Channel 4 behaves like a commercial organisation, whereas the BBC does not. It grows organically and then, unfortunately, gets taken advantage of.
But I think I recognise the point that my honourable friends made, but I would suggest that a number of the programmes on Channel 4 do add huge public good to the country and beyond, because many of the programmes that I enjoy actually on Channel 4 are very factual. They are not just of entertainment value. So I would suggest that Channel 4 does add huge public good, as does many other actual commercial stations as well do add quite important public goods. And for programmes in the arts and crafts and cultural sphere, it might mean Arts Council-style grants, particularly for the purest of public good, public service broadcasts, if appropriate, safeguards against these interest groups captures can be devised. These would not necessarily have to be made by the BBC, of course, but funded by a competitive tender through the BBC as a grant-awarding body. Or there could be more collaborative work with educational institutions such as the Open University or others to finance certain programme outputs. I certainly think it's worth looking at the potential for purchase ticketing for BBC recordings. At present, BBC shows are free to attend, but BBC tours are paid tickets. There is clearly a demand for those tours sufficient for the charges to be sustainable and for revenue to be raised. I wonder too, even if the huge waiting list in interest shows like Strictly Come Dancing, if the market mechanism of paid ticketing might be an option to manage that demand. I've heard it said that at one point the waiting list for audience tickets to Top Gear, as an example, was measured in decades. What an incentive it would be for the BBC to keep producing compelling programmes if audience ticket revenue were to be made. At the moment, tickets to the BBC shows are available to anyone in the UK who has a UK postcode. There is clearly something to be explored here in ticket pricing, perhaps even differential ticket pricing where a tour is included, or hospitality and so on. There is certainly a chance for some entrepreneurialism. I don't pretend for a moment that ticket sales would ever raise the sums raised by the TV licence, but it could be one stream in a number of streams that the BBC could pursue for certain programmes.
I think my honourable friend is making some very important points. Would he also concede that given that the BBC iPlayer is inaccessible outside the UK, but it has access to the BBC's back catalogue, which has been paid for over decades and decades by the licence fee payers, surely a huge source of income for the BBC would be allow people, the English-speaking world, access for a cost to the BBC iPlayer and the back catalogue of the BBC?
I thank my honourable friend for that point, and I would entirely agree. And as we've already mentioned here, the BBC does seek quite a significant income from broadcast rights that it makes internationally. I think they could build on that substantially if they were to use the BBC iPlayer brand more effectively overseas as well. Mr Wilson, the future of broadcasting, especially for the BBC, is an exciting one, and the BBC must not allow itself to stay in the past. I fear that the licence fee has become a comfort blanket that threatens to be a dead weight as other broadcasters move forward in the international market. As an admirer of the BBC, as someone who values it as a vital institution for our country, I hope it will enthusiastically embrace the opportunities for alternative funding streams that must be explored now that the television licence is all but an antique.
Currently.
Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I want to speak just very briefly on behalf of the 570 people in my Lincoln constituency who've signed the petition calling for the government to continue funding free TV licences for the over 75s. I also made mention earlier we were out at the weekend as a party and as the MP collecting signatures, and I would imagine we got at least another couple of hundred more on top of that. I'm proud that we were in the top 50 constituencies to oppose this unjust and mean-spirited policy. And I think it's totally unacceptable that over 4,400 households in Lincoln could lose their free TV licence under these plans. A recent survey found that 40% of older people say the television is their main source of company, but the government seemed determined to means test loneliness and isolation. Nationally, it's estimated that over 1.6 million pensioners living alone will lose their free TV licence in a means-tested system. I think it's absolutely symptomatic of this whole government, the whole approach. The government should not be offloading responsibility for funding free TV licences onto the BBC. In fact, it seems whatever question you ask in the chamber, it's always the responsibility is always pushed to somebody else. And it's particularly worrying that a further 1.3 million poorer over 75s who are eligible for pension credit but don't claim it are projected to lose their TV licence. And it's one of the reasons I'm going to launch a campaign in Lincoln to end the pension credit scandal. More than 1 million pensioners in the UK aren't getting the pension credit they're entitled to. And these are people who generally have worked all their lives. They should be getting these benefits. My campaign will seek to raise awareness and offer support to those who are missing out on this crucial support. I'm just going to end by saying as well, because I'm aware there's a lot of people that want to speak, and we're all saying the things along the same lines. It says an awful lot about this government that they choose to cut taxes for corporations and the highest earners whilst targeting their spending cuts on the vulnerable older people who are struggling to make ends meet. Absolutely typical of this government, and surely that's morally wrong.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you very much, Mr Wilson. It's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship, and I congratulate all of the petitioners that have made this debate happen. I declare an interest in that I am the chairman of the all-party parliamentary group for the BBC, which seeks to support the BBC but also be a critical friend where that's required. I was going to speak about the real positives that the BBC delivers, but I think my right honourable friend, the member for Wantage, has done just that. He reminds me of the quote from Lord Patton, who said that no one would invent the BBC today, but thank God our predecessors did. And in many sense, it is an anomaly, but it is much loved. In an era, as my honourable friend made clear, in an area where we have much to be concerned about in terms of bias, in terms of influence, in terms of commercialisation, in terms of exposure, perhaps to younger members of our audience. I think it's fantastic that the BBC still stands for independence, impartiality, entertainment, excellence and education. And I think that we would lose that at our peril. Indeed, one only has to speak to friends and colleagues that have moved abroad, and the one thing they tend to miss so much is watching the BBC. I will just pick up actually on one point that was raised between my honourable friend for Stoke-on-Trent South speech and the intervention from the honourable member for North West Leicestershire. We talked about the ability for the BBC to actually sell more of its content abroad. The concept called BritBox will actually allow, which is being pioneered by the BBC and ITV, is a good example of where the BBC does innovate, will actually allow audiences from outside the UK to view but be charged. So again, it's a good example where the BBC is trying to make money out of its own content. But Mr Wilson, I wanted to focus my remarks on the decision that the BBC has been required to take. And I say been required to take because I don't care what anyone says. There is no way that the BBC will be able to use 20% of its budget to be able to carry on with the position which is currently in place. And the BBC did consult widely, and I remember back in February inviting all MPs to come and hear about the proposals and what this would mean, and ask MPs to get involved and get their constituents involved as well. And so really the options were as follows. They could either copy the current scheme, which means that 4.64 million over 75-year-olds would continue as is, but that would cost £745 million, rising to £1 billion by the end of 2030 because when we celebrate it, we're all living longer, but that means that cost goes up. That would be the equivalent of the funding of BBC's 2, 3, 4 news channel and all of the children's output, so clearly not sustainable. And for those that say, well, what about Gary Lineker's salary? We should just bear in mind that if the BBC axed the pay for all of those above £150,000 in terms of talent, that would save 20 million. So still quite a long way to go into our 745 million. And by the way, I'm a big fan of Gary Lineker, and I think he gives value for money. The BBC could also... I'm sorry, I've lost members of the audience on that particular part. I'm surprised to hear that from the honourable member for Leicester North West, him being a sort of a great Leicester player. But I see. So, yeah, sorry, Brexit has obviously ended that relationship. But the second option was, of course, removing it altogether, which would mean that the poorest of over 75s would have no option at all. But to a certain degree, and I know the government would say that they funded the BBC to some regard, in a way, I'm somewhat surprised that the BBC have not removed it altogether as their option. The third option was a 50% discount, so everyone gets it over the age of 75, but only 50% of it. But that would still cost £415 million, so the entire budget of BBC Two. The other option was raising it to the age of 80. That would cost £481 million and would be the equivalent of BBC Two's budget or BBC Four. Or, where it was landed on, actually, of all of the options, this was the one that was most, I wouldn't say liked, because I don't think anyone liked this concept at all, but the one that found most favour was the option that the BBC has found itself in, which is to link the benefit to pension credit, which means that 900,000 over 75-year-olds will still benefit. It will cost 209 million, and that's my point. This is still a cost that the BBC will have to bear, greater, than, I would argue, than the funding they were given to take it on. And that's still going to be the cost of Radio 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, to some degree. And I think that's where the BBC have found itself. I believe in telling it as it is. The BBC, indeed, agreed to it, but I don't think they were given much option as far as this was concerned. It was either agree to this or something else. The BBC were not funded for it. I think it's absolutely the case, probably due to a copy and paste mechanism, that our last manifesto said that we would guarantee this for the term of Parliament. I'm not quite so confident that that does mean 2022, but we will see. But certainly, I certainly don't know something that you don't know as well. But I think that that means that we made a commitment in that manifesto pledge. And I think it now puts us in a very difficult position if the BBC are going to take away the licence fee for those that are outside the means test up to, from 2022, 2022, then it perhaps does lead an argument on the government benches. So that means that the government would need to carry on funding it, at least for those 2-year period. However, I will take issue, again, like my right honourable friend, I will now lose part of the room or perhaps all of it. Whilst I understand that there is a cost implication on those who can't afford it, because pension credit is at its lowest level, and those that are just outside the pension credit boundary will struggle to meet this cost, I absolutely recognise this. I have a fundamental problem, and I'm surprised that members opposite don't have the same fundamental problem. That if someone is a multi-millionaire and happen to be over the age of 75, they receive a free universal benefit. When somebody who is in their early 20s, renting, can't afford to buy a property of their own, is effectively subsidising that. Because, and I will give way in a second, I believe that there is a cost to everything, and there are choices. We spend £800 billion each year for our public services out of government spending. So that means that if we are spending it on people who can already afford it, then that means that somebody else has ultimately got to pay for it, or somebody is not going to receive that same benefit. I, of course, give way.
Thank you for giving way, and he's made some very interesting points. And there was a language that was used before by the previous speaker, which was, you used the term public good. And a public good is defined things like health, education, which we collectively feel are so important to us as a society that we provide them collectively. And I would say with the BBC, you kept using the honourable member kept using the expression, a public good. The BBC is a public good, it has a value for our democracy, a value for our community cohesion, it's a value for society generally. Therefore, we should pay for it collectively and not leave people who are over 75 who can't afford to pay for it themselves when they have no means. So we should be providing that collectively as a public good.
The honourable member, who I know worked for the BBC, I think he makes a very good point, because I would agree with him. It is a public good. But I think there are other public goods that one can think of where we do require people to pay, or we actually means test it. And so I have a fundamental issue, and I do believe that it was, I'm sorry to use the words, an election bribe. And then once you give something out for free, it's very difficult to then ask people to start paying for it, and I recognise the challenge. But I would ask all honourable and right honourable members to just consider this. If there's always going to be a cost, and we have to make decisions, then can it be right, and when we talk about the welfare state, and it should come back to the welfare state, should it be the case that the welfare state is providing something for people who can readily afford it themselves, and thus we are unable to spend more on those who really are perhaps at that borderline? And I say that not to get any electoral gain. I represent a constituency which I think is second in having the highest proportion of over 75-year-olds in the entire country. So I commit electoral suicide. But I think it's important that we address this, because if we don't, we will find that there are other decisions that get made or don't get reviewed. And then there are those, and I'm particularly worried about intergenerational fairness, who are just missing out because we preserve things for people just on the basis of age rather than on the basis of means. So my last point would be back to the Minister. She is an excellent Minister, and I think she has inherited this package, if I call it that, from predecessors in the Treasury. I do believe we need to look at this again. I do believe there is a big challenge, and that we made a commitment on our manifesto, which we should stick by. But as for the future, and this gives us time for the future, I would like us to address whether it's affordable to give people a benefit that they would be able to pay for themselves.
I too want to speak in support of the petition for the restoration of free TV licences for the over 75. And like many other honourable members, was deeply concerned with the announcement that the TV licence concession for over 75s would now be linked to pension credit. And as many honourable members have said, this is a problem of the government's own making. Ministers cannot hide behind the BBC because it was their decision to outsource responsibility for TV licences, despite the manifesto pledge to maintain the benefit. As the Honourable Member for Warrington North said, they've been devolving the blame. 3,770 households in Newport East are set to lose their licences under the changes, and across the wider Gwent region, this rises to 23,450 households, with a total annual cost across all households of over 567,000. As other honourable members have said, TV licences are an important benefit for older people who suffer disproportionately from isolation and loneliness. And as the excellent Age Cymru have said, for millions of over 75-year-olds, it's not just the box in the corner, it's the constant companion and their window on the world and their main form of company. TV is also an essential source of information for people who aren't online, and plays a crucial role in their ability to be an active citizen in a democracy. Research from Age Cymru shows that only 29% of people aged 75 and over use the internet in Wales. The shift of information online has already made it more difficult for older people to keep informed and be able to access key services. Removing this entitlement to a free TV licence would add substantially to these kinds of difficulties. Linking the concession to pension credit is also hugely problematic. The DWP's own estimates suggest that 2 out of 5 people eligible for pension credit are not claiming the benefit. So in Newport East alone, that's almost 5 million of unclaimed pension credit, which is not reaching the people it needs every year. And until the government acts to ensure that everyone who's entitled to pension credit receives it, a huge number of older people risk losing out on 2 benefits at once if the TV licence proposals go ahead. And this is the problem with it not being universal. As Age Cymru have highlighted, there are many reasons why older people don't claim pension credit. They may not know the benefit exists, they may not feel they're entitled to any help, they may be put off by the process of claiming, they may struggle on a loan, assuming that others are worse off than them, or they may, as other members have said, be living with dementia. In practical terms, there are serious questions to ask about how the BBC will ensure that people with dementia will be able to pay their licence fee. And if they don't, how non-payment will be enforced. It doesn't bear thinking about, I don't think, as Age Cymru has said, there's 850,000 people who may be affected by this. I just want to finish by citing an example from my constituency. In the week when the licence fee proposals were outlined, candidates in the Conservative leadership election began to outline their plans to cut taxes for the wealthiest in society.
Days later, I was contacted by the neighbour of an 86-year-old armed forces veteran in Newport who is set to lose his TV licence under the new proposals. The fact that I know ministers at the Ministry of Defence are concerned about this, but this contrast underlines and just amplifies that the party opposite has a serious question to answer about where its priorities lie, and is this the kind of country they want us to live in? So I'll echo the calls from campaigners and charities like Age Cymru for the UK Government to take back the funding and the administration fee of the free TV licence scheme and let the BBC focus on its job of being a brilliant national broadcaster. TV licences are a social benefit which shouldn't have been outsourced.
Because
pleasure to take part in this debate under your chairmanship. Like some of my Conservative colleagues, I'm broadly speaking a supporter of the BBC, and I would readily admit though that that's weakening somewhat. The member for Wantage and the member for Henley outlined some of the great benefits ranging from the support for the proms and the orchestras and of course the World Service that the member for Henley was an eminent was it producer, director for? And you know, speaking for myself, I would happily pay the licence fee for Radio 4, Local Radio and Test Match Special, just to name three. But as has been pointed out, we can afford it. I rather wish that Radio 4 would go silent at 6:30 in the evenings for these inane comedies, but that's just a personal opinion. I think in terms of the celebrity and sports star payments and so on, the BBC does need to reflect on this. The reality is that the $1.75 million paid to Gary Lineker. I'm sorry his name keeps coming up. But I think the BBC do need to reflect that as a public sector organisation, $1.75 million is out of bounds to most people. Certainly those I represent wouldn't earn that in their lifetimes of 40 to 50 years. And you know, would I still watch Match of the Day if it was some unknown presenting it? The answer is yes, because I don't watch it to hear the gossip. I watch it to see the action. And so I do think it's important that the BBC, as I say, reflect on that. In respect of the over 75s, yes, it's certainly true. This was a day that was certain to come. It was, as we've heard from the Right Honourable Member for Wantage, a policy foisted on the BBC by the Treasury. And it was inevitable that the BBC were going to opt out at the first possible opportunity, and it was inevitably going to cause embarrassment to an administration in office at that time, and so it is, and it's given a great opportunity for members opposite to have a go at the government, when in actual fact they did very little in this respect on their own. And the Honourable Member for Warrington North moved on from the arguments about the licence to the leadership of the Conservative Party and reflected on some of the policies my honourable friends have put forward. And she said, well, tax cuts, we around this table don't need tax cuts. Well, perhaps so, but we also don't need free TV licences. And therefore, the sustainability of these universal benefits has got to be looked at, whether it's TV licences, bus passes or whatever. They cannot go on draining the taxpayer when, in actual fact, there are so many absolutely essential services that are needed. I mean, the member for Lincoln is no longer in her place, but she referenced a survey. Now, if you go out onto the streets of Cleethorpes, just as in Lincoln, and say, would you rather pay for something or would you rather have it free? It's no surprise that they said, oh, we'd rather have it for nothing. But the reality, of course, is very different. When it comes to news bias, there's no doubting that the BBC is in effect the guardian of the airwaves rather than the Daily Express of the airwaves or whatever. And it's not so much that there is perhaps a bias, and of course the BBC will say we get as many complaints from one side as we do from the other, so therefore we must be getting it right.
The reality that is, though, that there is a rather superior intonation in some of the questions from interviewers, as if to say, you're very superior. Do you really think that people would vote for Brexit? That is an insult to the 70% of my electorate who voted for Brexit, and very wise they are too. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Honourable friend for giving. Will he also accept that the potential for bias of the BBC is not only about the way they report, what they report, but the fact that 70% of the public rely on them for much of their news, and the BBC have the power to decide what is or what isn't reported in the news?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and there is no doubting that many very important events in this country and around the world go unreported when items which, in the great scheme of things, are perhaps more trivial, do find their way onto the airways, perhaps because that's a reflection of the organisation itself. I'm still, as I mentioned, Mr Wilson, broadly speaking, a supporter of the BBC, and I'd like to see it continue in some shape or form. Whether that is realistic in this multi-channel age, when sports rights, for example, cost the absolute earth, we now see a lesser sport, shall we say, coming on to the BBC, and I have no problem with that. It's only right that they should get an airing. But when we look at, for example, the success of the Lionesses in the recent World Cup, there is no doubt that Sky, BT, or someone will come sniffing around by the time the next Women's World Cup comes on, and that means it will be lost to the great majority. And we saw only yesterday how, with the Cricket World Cup, how free-to-air does bring the country together on these great sporting occasions. As I say, I'm still, broadly speaking, a supporter. If I'm home by 10 o'clock tonight, I suspect I'll watch the 10 o'clock news on the BBC rather than any of the other offerings. But I think the BBC do need to reflect. I'm content with the present system continuing for at least the foreseeable future. I'm not entirely convinced that the majority of my constituents would agree with that. And I do think that causes the BBC, or should cause the BBC, and indeed the Minister, to reflect on the present structure and whether it can continue.
Yeah, great speech, Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Thank you. It's also a great pleasure to follow the debate that was opened by my honourable friend for Warrington North, who I thought gave an outstanding introduction as normal. And she talked about the not me gov government, and she's absolutely right, because the consistent modus operandi of this government when it comes to public services is to slash funding for a particular public authority, and then when that public authority is unable to deliver the service, to blame that public authority for failing to deliver the service, or when the public authority has to put up its own prices to compensate for the lack of money from central government, to attack them politically for putting up prices. We've seen it with local government and failures of local government services. We've seen it in the fire service, for example. We've seen it in the police, where the epidemic, the horror of knife crime that we're seeing isn't apparently anything to do with the 20,000 fewer police officers or the cuts to children's services. Apparently it's all the fault of the Mayor of London. And similarly, we're seeing this in the debate over the BBC licence fee, where the BBC was presented with huge cuts to its budget, and then when it had to put up the licence fee for over 75s, the BBC was forced to take the blame. It is part of a consistent practice by this government, and it needs to be exposed and it needs to be resisted. The honourable gentleman from Bexhill and Battle talked about some of the services that would be affected where the BBC having to take on the whole of this amount, which is in total could be as much as 700 odd million a year. That would be the cost of BBC 2 and BBC 4, the News Channel, the Scotland Channel and Radio 5, and crucially, local radio stations. And the BBC, as we're seeing with the crisis in local newspapers, the BBC is often the only real provider of quality local news in some areas at the moment, the local news that binds local communities together. And it is able to do that because of the licence fee. And there is what is known as an ecosystem within for the funding of our broadcasters, because each broadcaster in the UK is funded differently. So ITV is funded, Dame Cheryl, largely through advertising with some production work. Sky has a subscription and some production work and advertising, but it all knits together particularly well. And I have to say, if we moved away from a subscription channel to where the BBC or parts of the BBC had to use either subscription or enter into advertising, I'm pretty sure that the existing channels not only wouldn't be happy about that, but their operations would be damaged as well. And this is without any kind of discussion about how we take on the influence of the global giants based on the west coast of the United States. Now, I do have a problem as well with the size of some of the salaries paid to BBC presenters. I have a particular problem with the use of the word talent to describe on-air performers and on-air presenters, whether it's radio or TV, because that suggests that the whole of the attraction of a particular broadcast is based around the individual who presents it. A makeup artist is talented, a production designer is talented, a junior producer is talented, and the quality of the programming is vested in all of those, and not simply in the person who is in front of the microphone or in front of the camera. So why on earth did the BBC accept this cut to its budget and the enforcement of having to take on the over 75s licence? The simple truth is, and I think other honourable members have mentioned this already, they were forced to. If you speak to BBC senior management, they were left in absolutely no doubt that this was being forced on them. My honourable friend for Newcastle-under-Lyme, who was on the DCMS Select Committee with me, called it a drive-by shooting. Treasury Minister, I think it was George Osborne at the time, was Chancellor, came in to the BBC and told them this is the way it's going to be, so make the best of it. So when the BBC management came out and suggested that, well, actually they were quite happy with the solution, they weren't happy, but what else could they say? They had a gun to their head. But there's another reason, a more sinister reason. I was on the DCMS Select Committee previously, and when the chair of the BBC came up for scrutiny and confirmation, Rona Fairhead was the existing chair of the BBC Trust. And we were given information before she came to that meeting that when she had been in to Downing Street to see the then Prime Minister David Cameron, after that meeting, she had had a private meeting with David Cameron without any civil servants present. This was put to her and she admitted that it was the case. As it happened, we declined to confirm her appointment. But it does rather beg the question, why didn't the BBC governors at the time, resist the over 75 licence fee being deposited on them? Coincidentally, Rona Fairhead was shortly afterwards appointed to the House of Lords and was appointed a member of the government. I'm not suggesting that those two incidences are linked. Well, my honourable friend from Manchester Blackley suggests there should be. But it does not give off a particularly pleasant smell. And it is one part of the government giving out favours in order to get a policy through, and it stinks, and it ought not to be allowed. The perception ought not to be allowed that a deal was done, because that is possibly one of the perceptions. The BBC licence fee, as we've heard, is so much more. Is so much more than simply a broadcasting service for older people in particular. And I simply ask the question, if we don't provide the service and social isolation continues, what is the cost then of having to look after more people with more advanced dementia? What is the cost of having to provide social services elsewhere for older people whose quality of life is deteriorating? There's hidden costs in this, and actually once again we find, Dame Cheryl, that the BBC licence fee gives huge value for money across a much broader range than simply listening to the radio or watching television.
Clive Lewis.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's a pleasure to appear under your chairship. As has already been mentioned, I do need to declare an interest. Unlike the Honourable Member for Henley, I rejected the advice of my father, who said I had a great face for radio, and instead decided to become a BBC TV reporter. I'd also like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Warrington North, who secured this crucial debate on the BBC, and what could be more crucial in this period of political instability than BBC bias, which is what I would like to address my speech to today. I will not be mentioning Panorama at all. I think honourable members will be pleased to hear. I don't need to. This is a target-rich environment. And when it comes to BBC bias, impartiality and the BBC, we often find, as in this debate, a lot of contradictory claims and counterclaims. And this is partly because the BBC produces a vast content featuring a range of people and opinions, meaning that everyone will at some point see something to complain about. Unfortunately, this has at times led representatives and defenders of the BBC to dismiss all criticism of its reporting. If we're attacked from both sides, the argument goes, then we must be doing something right. But when faced with conflicting claims, you don't just dismiss them all and assume everything is fine. You have to assess which are accurate or which are more accurate. Just as when it comes to climate change, there is the weight of evidence in the scientific community, and then there are the ideas put about by right-wing think tanks, newspapers and politicians. Similarly, when it comes to debates around the BBC, there are allegations of bias advanced by many of those same right-wing interests. And then there are the findings of independent academic research. So what does the social scientific evidence tell us about BBC impartiality? One consistent finding is that the BBC allows the press and senior politicians to set the agenda for its reporting. In the BBC's Bridcut report of 2007, it acknowledged that impartiality should mean representing a range of views in society, not just the perceived political centre ground or the balance of opinion in Westminster. But research by Cardiff University found that 5 years later, BBC News was still dominated by elite sources with, and this is key, an overrepresentation of conservative and Eurosceptic views. During the EU referendum, this impartiality as balance paradigm, which seems to always lean to the right, was applied very scrupulously to the two sides of the referendum campaign, but with the right dominating both. Research by Loughborough University found that Conservative and UKIP representatives together accounted for 74% of all party political appearances on television news, whilst Cardiff found an even higher level of prominence, with Conservatives and UKIP together accounting for almost 80% of politicians. The striking domination of our political debate by this right is exacerbated by the influence of right-wing newspapers. One of the key functions of the BBC should be to act as a bulwark against misinformation and the abuses of private power. But how can it perform this function if its news agenda is to be set by an often unscrupulous, partisan press owned by a handful of billionaires, which has spent decades misinforming people on every important issue of the day? Again, look at the research. Cardiff University found that over half of BBC TV News policy stories during the 2015 general election originated with the press, namely the Telegraph and the Times leading the pack, and once again, the right dominating overall. Another crucial issue that all of this has impacted on, alongside reporting on immigration and the EU, is austerity. There is now a fairly substantive body of work examining the reporting of the 2008 financial crisis, including, for example, Mike Berry's recent book. Berry shows that the economic debate at that crucial time for our country was skewed towards the right, and that even mainstream economic opinion was marginalised in favour of the disinformation emanating from the Conservative Party and their allies in the press. Now, I could go on, but the overall picture is clear. BBC News is not only overwhelmingly orientated towards the political and economic establishment, insofar as it exhibits any political bias, it tends to be towards the right. The story behind this pattern of reporting is detailed in Tom Mill's 2016 book on the BBC. The organisation has always been a quasi-state broadcaster, orientated towards officialdom and particularly vulnerable to pressure from the government of the day as the last charter renewal process showed. But the situation got much worse from the 1980s onwards, when the BBC became increasingly marketised and politicised. Independent reporting was curtailed as editorial managerial authority was consolidated, funding was cut, and service and programme making were contracted out. In short, the BBC's public service ethos, which anyway was always far too elitist, was steadily eroded, whilst the BBC was slowly privatised. None of this opened up the BBC to a wider range of voices. Privately educated Oxford graduates still dominate the BBC, just as they do the press, as a recent Sutton Trust report shows. But the BBC was now an elitist organisation more in step with neoliberal Britain. No doubt the Brexiteers want to see a BBC that is even more right-wing, even more vulnerable to government pressure, even less economically literate in its reporting, or alternatively, no BBC at all. Meanwhile, there are some on the left who are so disillusioned with the BBC that they have given up on it altogether. This is a mistake. There are serious problems with the BBC which cannot be ignored, but they can be resolved by making the BBC genuinely independent of governments, of the left and the right, and accountable not to a narrow elite, but to its own staff and the communities it should represent. The left has always been a friend to the BBC and should remain so, but securing a public and democratic media system with the BBC at its heart will require radical change.
Hugh Gaffney.
Thank you, Dame Cheryl, for calling me to speak in this important debate for pensioners across the country. Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I also want to thank the member for Wellington North by bringing this debate, along with the 170,000 people who signed the online petition, calling for the government to protect free TV licence for those aged 75 and over. They also join the 600,000 people who have signed Age UK's pension petition, calling for the government to act on this issue. There is a real sense of public anger at the injustice of a decision to end free TV licence for all those aged 75 and over, with many saying they will not pay. I have felt the public anger in my constituency of Coatbridge, Christon and Bellshill. Many of my constituents cannot understand why the government is refusing to stand up for its pensioners. I have also spoken to those constituents who were directly affected by the government's inaction, and they come from over 3,000 local households who are set to lose their free TV licence in my constituency. This government have betrayed the constituents along with the pensioners of this country. There was a clear promise in the 2017 Conservative Party manifesto that free TV licence will be protected until the end of this Parliament. Yet, this government chose to outsource responsibility and the financial burden of a free TV licence to the BBC. The government have successfully shifted the blame onto the BBC for the decision to end free TV licence for all those aged 75 and over. But it's the government who must take responsibility. They made a cynical promise to pensioners which they had no intention of keeping. I have spoken out in Parliament repeatedly to highlight the government's promise to our pensioners now lies in tatters. When the Labour Party held an opposition debate on this issue, the government benches were all but empty. The government didn't dare vote against Labour's motion because they know that they have betrayed the trust of the pensioners across the country. And when I confronted the Prime Minister on this issue at Prime Minister's questions, her answer could not have been weaker. The Prime Minister told the BBC to think again. Prime Minister, and your days are numbered, I think you must think again. She was the architect of the 2017 Conservative Manifesto, which contained a clear promise to protect free TV licence for those aged 75 and over. In one of her last acts as Prime Minister, she should live up to the pledge she gave when she first entered Downing Street to tackle the burning injustices in our society. She should protect our pensioners by ensuring that free TV licence for all those aged 75 and over are maintained. As things stand, a free TV licence will be restricted to those people aged 75 and over who are claiming pension credit from June 2020. The BBC claim that this will ensure the poorest pensioners are protected, but let us look at the BBC's own analysis. It found that just 11% of the poorest households would keep their free TV licence if it was linked to the pension credit. The poorest tenth of over 75s would have to spend more than 2% of their total income on the TV licence. And there are clearly issues with the take-up of the pension credit. Mentioned earlier, the DWP's latest estimates highlight that 2 out of the 5 age 75 or over should not be claiming pension credit have not done so. Independent Age found that there are over £7 million of pension credit going unclaimed in my own constituency of Coatbridge, Christon and Bellshill alone. If there's 7 million in my constituency, how much more is out there? Yet this government appears to be doing nothing, very little, to encourage a greater take-up of pension credit amongst those people aged 75 and over. In conclusion, let's be clear that the decision to restrict free TV licence will also increase both poverty and, more importantly, loneliness amongst our pensioners. 1 in 4 over 75 say that the TV is their main source of company. That is their main source of company, bringing up a family, being left alone. I know that. I lost my mother last year, and I know my dad depends so much on the TV nowadays. And this decision will do nothing to stop the continuing rise of pensioner poverty across the UK. We're often told by the government they're on the side of the pensioners, yet they continue to refuse to act to protect pensioners' interests. It is time for the government to stop blaming the BBC and start taking responsibility. It is time for them to keep their promise, protect the TV licence for the over 75s.
Gillian, glad to see you in your place, having supported HS2, I'm sure, very recently. Right. David Plowright was one of the great leaders of commercial television. He was the chief executive of Granada Television for many years, where great documentaries under World in Action were produced, groundbreaking drama, excellent regional news. He went on from being that to be the deputy chair of Channel 4. His criterion for the BBC, who you might have thought was one of his main competitors, was that the BBC was there to keep the commercial side of television honest. And he wanted to support it, and he wanted it to be as good as it possibly could be. And I think it's interesting this evening that all round this debate, people in different degrees have supported the BBC. Nobody would create it as it is today if we were starting from afresh, but it has an enormous amount of support, respect and affection. My worry is when we come to talk about bias and other aspects of the BBC, that there is a certain decadence within the organisation, and by decadence I mean there is a decaying of standards in all sorts of areas of reporting, which, if it continues, might mean that if this debate was to take place in 5 or 10 years, there wouldn't be as much support for what is in effect the state broadcaster supported by a flat rate tax. I think I agree partially with my honourable friend from Norwich South. There is one obvious reason for this, and there may well be other reasons for it. The people who run the BBC, the people who report for the BBC, who work for the BBC, are primarily drawn from London and Oxbridge, and they have a common view of the world that leads to certain conclusions. My guess is, and this was where I would disagree probably with my honourable friend from Norwich South. It gives them a almost coherent, homogeneous view of the EU and what our relationship with the EU should be. But it also, and I think this is more difficult to substantiate, but I nevertheless think it is true, it means that privately they think they're right and their view of the world is correct. And the people who I represent, by and large, are not as well educated, have not got the same level of either income or educational achievement, are probably wrong. It's never stated publicly, but I have many friends who are BBC executive and reporters who do their best. I would never question the integrity of individual BBC reporters. They're doing their best, but it is the fact that you will not get many people from the poorest parts of the United Kingdom who are working in the BBC and would give a different view of it. And I think that is one of the reasons why we have such high salaries. In an organisation from that background, having a salary of nearly £2 million might not seem as obscene as it does to most of the people I represent. And I don't believe Gary Lineker was a great footballer. I don't believe he is, whatever it is, 20 times or 15 times better at his job than Gabby Logan. Of course I give way.
Thank you, Cheryl. I thank the honourable member for giving way. I think the point I want to make is not so much around Gary Lineker, but just the fact that the BBC operates in a commercial environment. Therefore, if it doesn't pay its talent a commercial wage, and many of them actually earn less than the commercial wage, then it will lose that talent to other organisations, and then people switch off the BBC, and therefore they'll lose viewers.
I think that's a reasonable point as far as it goes. The BBC has not only paid very high salaries in a discriminatory way over the last 5 years. When they were found to be discriminating, they increased those salaries. But it is also the case that there are places within the BBC that have to compete commercially. The fact that they've increased the number of people presenting sports programmes actually shows there isn't a shortage. They can get very high quality people at a lower rate. And if Gary Lineker goes to BT or to Sky, the people who are there earning a lot less, I think, are as good. So I think I understand the argument, but I don't think it actually stands up in that case and many others. I think John Humphreys is one of the best interviewers probably there has been on the BBC, and he's dropped his salary as well. But I don't think he was ever worth more than £600,000, or that the private sector were going to pay that amount of money for him. I have no idea what Andrew Neil gets paid at the moment, but I think it's a great pity that another great interviewer is leaving the BBC. I don't know if that's commercial pressure or just because he's a bit cheeky, and teases the BBC management. But I think it's a great pity. He gives politicians all around the clock a pretty tough and torrid time when he interviews them, and that's a great thing for democracy. But I think from that narrow base, we do get a distorted view. And incidentally, I also take the honourable gentleman from Bexhill and Battle's view that 20 million would not pay for the BBC, would not pay for the licence fee for the over 75s. I accept that's just simple arithmetic. But, and it is a big but, 20 million is still quite a lot of money. And one of the qualities that I appreciate of the BBC is regional radio, which is massively underfunded. And 20 million for regional radio would go a long way. Compared to when I started in politics, which is a long time ago, what is put out by Radio Manchester now, in terms of its political coverage and the rest of its coverage, on less resources, isn't as comprehensive. The quality of the people doing it is excellent, but there just simply isn't as many of them, and there isn't as much, and that's because of underfunding. I want to give 3 or 4 examples, if I may, Mrs. Gillen, of where I think this cohort of southeastern Oxbridge-educated people get it wrong. And I would say, and the point's being made as well, any organisation with human beings in it is going to make mistakes. So the mistakes themselves are mistakes, but I think they do indicate a larger problem with the BBC. The BBC procured and presented on BBC Three, when it was a programme, a series of programmes called People Like Us. And it was based in the ward I used to represent as a councillor and is still in the constituency I represent. It was, quite frankly, Mrs. Gillen, it was poverty porn. It gave the most distorted view of one of the poorest wards in the country, depending quite how you count these things. It's not a competition any ward or any constituency wants to win, but Harper Hay is the poorest or the 3rd poorest ward in the country. Cameras went along and they pretended, and it was a pretence, that they were following how people in Harper Hay lived, and they weren't. They weren't. They were distorting it. They paid girls to fight each other. They opened a pub and created a most peculiar party of transvestites. I have nothing against transvestites, but that kind of situation had never happened in that particular public house, which had been closed for a couple of years. They got a pretend landlord in to talk about how he was very happy for his tenants to take drugs. It was clearly a put-up job, and some of the people who said outrageous things were taken on holiday by the company doing it. It was a shocking and terrible thing, but I don't believe if people from that kind of background had been part of the BBC, that programme would ever have been made. Fortunately, there was not a second series. The head of BBC Three was good enough to see me and Councillor Carney, who represented the ward, and I don't know if it was our lobbying that did it, but it wasn't. There wasn't a second series of it. The other area, well, there's 2 other areas I want to talk about. One is bias on the EU. Again, my honourable friend for Norwich South, who made a speech which I half completely agreed with and half completely disagreed with. I think there is quite a lot of evidence in terms of the number of people interviewed about the European Union that there are more pro-EU people. In the run-up to the referendum, virtually every business person who was interviewed on the Today programme was asked how Brexit was going to damage their business. In fact, it became a standard form of question or statement. In spite of Brexit, this benefit or this increase in jobs has happened. There has been a number of independent research groups who have shown the bias in the run-up to European elections, who have done the counting of the number of people who were pro-EU compared to the number of people who were anti-EU, and the pros will win by about 3 to 1. In fact, one of the senior political journalists has said we have no need to be balanced in this matter, which I think is at odds with constitution. And the difference during the run-up to the referendum campaign was striking. The BBC did what it does in general elections. It was perfectly well balanced, and that was a contrast to what happened afterwards and what had happened before the period of the referendum. And I think that is partly the reason that the people who run the BBC in London are essentially all pro-EU and think that people who aren't, there is something peculiar about them. My background, Mrs. Gillen, is as a scientist. I believe in the scientific method. I practiced 10 years on an analytical laboratory, so I am not, in the way that some people mean it, a climate skeptic. But I do think that some of the science, if one looks at the University of East Anglia and the leaked emails, is a bit dodgy, a lot dodgy in that case. I think some of the conclusions that are brought and some of the policies to deal with climate change are expensive, and one needs to be sceptical about the expense of those policies. And not only are the cohort that run the BBC from Oxbridge, they are happier talking about the subjunctive than they are talking about the second law of thermodynamics. But they have very clear views on quite what the perception of science and climate change is. I'll give an example. It's, I think, quite extraordinary. Now, the Noble Lord Peter Lilly and I disagree probably about everything, but we appeared on a programme about the Met Office with Quentin Letts. Quentin Letts did the interviewing. And Noble Lord Peter Lilly has a scientific background. He's got a degree from Cambridge in physics. We both thought that we agreed, basically, that climate change is happening, the planet's warming up a bit, but the response is not, is probably overblown. I said that the Met Office was very good at short-term forecasting, but hopeless at medium and long-term forecasting. If you tried, Mrs. Gillen, to get a recording of that programme now, you would not be able to do it. It is banned. It's like the Catholic Church in the 16th century. We are on a banned list because we agreed. This was unbalanced. So on the EU, there is no balance. On a relatively trivial matter, the scientifically illiterate people at the BBC have decided to ban us. So I think there are real problems in the future if the BBC don't sort these things out. I will now finish, sorry, I've spoken for slightly longer than I intended to, on the issue of free licence fees. It's not really worth a great deal of further thought. It's quite obvious that the government should be responsible, not the BBC, for a benefit like free television licences for the over 75s. What I think is worth further consideration is the licence fee, not next week, but in the near future. I find it strange that on my side of the House there is enthusiasm support on a number of issues, and I could name them, but I won't, but for flat rate taxes which are regressive. If there is a public good and a public benefit for the television, which I think there is, then I believe in progressive taxation and it coming out of income tax. The argument against that is often put by BBC executives is that damages the independence of the BBC. I think my honourable friend from Chester knocked that one clearly on the head on a very specific case, because the people running the BBC, it's part of the sort of informal ruling class in London. They scratch each other's back, and there isn't a complete independence there. And anyway, governments have always set the level of the licence fee. So every 5 years, the government has a say. And I don't see why we shouldn't have progressive taxation rather than a regressive taxation to fund what is undoubtedly a public good. So, with that, Mrs. Gillen, the BBC today has had a lot of support, but it does have to look at how it funds its regional organisations and how it stops being a cosmopolitan elite with all the narrow views that implies.
Well, Mr Grogan, could I just remind colleagues that with an eye to the main chamber, there is a possibility that votes may come during our proceedings here, in which case I will suspend and we will have to return. This is the last backbench speech from Mr Grogan, and then we'll move on to the frontbench speeches. John Grogan.
Dame Cheryl, it's a great pleasure to follow my honourable friend, and he spoke about science, and I think science is one of the areas that the BBC has definitely improved on in recent years. But it's an even greater joy to take part in a debate started by my honourable friend from Warrington. She always does it with such style and panache, which we can all only envy, whatever the subject. And given that it's a summer's evening, Dame Cheryl, and given we've hardly mentioned the great triumph in the Cricket World Cup yesterday, which was broadcast by Test Match Special, I want to find reasons to be cheerful. I want to cherish the BBC, and I want to suggest some interventions that can help not just the BBC, but other public service broadcasters. And I want to refer to some ideas that have come up from other honourable members. Now, the honourable gentleman from Cleethorpes, the best town on the East Coast by far, so I hear, he mentioned sport and the loss of sports rights for the BBC. And this has been a tremendous weekend for sport. Not only the World Cup cricket, which was watched by a total peak audience of 7.9 million on Channel 4 and Sky, but the BBC actually beat it with Wimbledon, attracting a peak audience of 9.6 million. And that didn't happen by accident. That happened because the Wimbledon tennis finals are part of the listed events, those events that must be offered to free-to-air television. And we shouldn't in the future have to rely on the public relations of Comcast or Sky to make sure we can see these big events. And you mentioned the Women's World Cup, which attracted over 11 million people. It's no good just showing one event every 15 years. You've got to tell the story over a number of months, if not years, over a tournament. And I think, Dame Cheryl, there's a clear now growing call for events like the Women's World Cup and also the men's and women's T20 and 50 overs Cricket World Cup. The games that involve England and the final and the other home nations should be on free-to-air TV. And I saw the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party made an interesting, if underreported, speech about this subject the other day. And I think that's an intervention that we should now make. Prominence of BBC channels and other public service broadcasting channels has been something that Ofcom have been looking at. They have come out with some rather good recommendations, to my mind, that talk of the public service channels being prominent, not just on traditional TVs, but on set-top boxes, on streaming services, on smart TV. And I hope the government and Ofcom, I hope the government will find time to put this into legislation pretty quickly in order to that the licence fee payer always finds it easy to see BBC channels and other channels that are public service broadcasters. The BBC iPlayer has been mentioned. Ofcom have said that they're minded to allow the BBC to keep programmes on the iPlayer for up to a year. And I think that would be a good thing. It's what is reflected amongst some of its commercial competitors. And equally, I'm hopeful that the Ofcom will agree to the proposals for BritBox, which have been mentioned. This exists in places like the United States at the moment, but it's basically the BBC and ITV and hopefully other public service broadcasters after a period providing packages of streaming for their big hit programmes and so on, and getting additional revenue stream. And I hope that, unlike the Project Kangaroo, which was a similar project 10 years ago, which was rejected by Ofcom, Ofcom will recognise that now the BBC is operating in a completely different market. Netflix spends $8 billion a year, Dame Cheryl, on programming. There's also Amazon and Facebook and so on. And the BBC must be allowed to compete with these global media giants. Just one or two other points to pick up from the debate. We heard about people being jailed for not paying the licence fee. This number of people who have gone to prison has gone down dramatically. It was 50 in 2012. It was 17 in 2017. These were not people sent to jail by the TV's licensing authority. They were sent to jail by magistrates, often for paying not just not paying the licence fee, but multiple other debts as well. So I think it's wise to keep this in context. Equally, the argument the honourable member for Henley advanced, he didn't like the tennis, as he made clear, switching to the tennis, but the other thing he was rather more pro was advertising. And as my honourable friend for Chester said, if you allowed widespread advertising on the BBC, it would totally destabilise the traditional market. ITV and Channel 4 would be lobbying very hard against that, because it would destroy a large part of their income stream. The question of bias has been raised. Some people haven't dealt with the Panorama programme. I'm quite happy to mention the Panorama programme. In fact, there's been a whole series of Panorama programmes in the last few weeks. I think there's one this week dealing with relationship education. There's one dealing with abortion in the United States, one dealing with exiting the EU and what a no deal might mean, and one dealing with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I think they were all perfectly legitimate programmes. There's this gentleman who I think goes by the name of Seamus Milne. I think he works in the leader's office. I think he might fit the profile of public school-educated southeastern Oxbridge that some of my honourable friends are very, very agitated about. But and no doubt in all those institutions, as he was growing up, to use a cricketing analogy, he was advised to play the ball, not the man. And I think that is very sensible advice. And to find my party tackling the credibility of a very distinguished journalist was not the finest moment. And I think of another Milne, Alistair Milne, which perhaps Seamus should look back at his record. And he was a man who defended the BBC against the government, possibly paid for his job with it. And that, I think, is a far better example to follow. I won't make more than another couple of points, Dame Cheryl. One is we've heard a lot about the voice of the BBC and how people come from the same background. Maybe that was true some time ago, but I do think it has changed over the last couple of decades. It's partly changed by the move to Manchester. You get a range of northern voices now across 5 Live and BBC News. It's always a great pleasure to show BBC apprentices around Parliament. They reflect the diversity of our nation. And just finally, James Cheryl, to say, on the substance of the petitions, and there's no point repeating what other members have said, other than to say, certainly I think George Osborne was to blame, but he was not the only Chancellor of the Exchequer who approached a TV licence fee negotiations in the same way. I don't think Gordon Brown in his time was particularly more forthcoming in terms of consultation. And I think it is up to this House eventually to put greater rules on how the licence fee is determined, that there should be more consultation, there should be a time period that everyone knows, there shouldn't just be a meeting that suddenly the Chancellor comes out of or the Director General comes out of and the announcement is made. That is a big decision for the country going forward, the future of the licence fee and so on, and the future of the BBC. The BBC belongs to us all, not just the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the day, and that should be reflected in the way we award the Royal Charter for the BBC and also in the way we set the licence fee.
Thank you very much. We move to the front bench wind-ups. Brendan O'Mara.
Thank you, Chair. It is always a pleasure to see you in the chair this afternoon. And I'd like to thank and congratulate all 15 members who have taken part in this very important debate so far. And in the spirit of the confessional which has been prevalent this afternoon, I too should put on record that I am also a former employee of the BBC for about a decade, and I've spoken extensively of my time at the BBC. So I will, in the time I have available to me this afternoon, concentrate my remarks on the issue which has kind of dominated this afternoon's proceedings, and that is the decision to means test a licence fee for those aged 75 and above. And let me say at the outset that, in the opinion of the SNP, it is absolutely outrageous that the UK government has sought to shift what is a welfare policy decision onto the BBC and thereby shirk its responsibility
to support our older citizens. Not only that, but in doing so, as we've heard so often this afternoon, the UK Government has shamefully broken its manifesto commitment on TV licences to over 75s. Its 2017 manifesto made an explicit promise, on page 66 to be exact, that it would maintain pensioner benefits, and it made specific mention of free bus passes, eye tests, prescriptions and TV licences for the duration of the Parliament. And I'm glad to see that so many members on the government benches recognise this, particularly the Honourable Member for Bexhill and Battle. And I would urge the Minister, when she does speak, to explain why they are breaking this promise. And I would urge her also to commit now to move to ensure that our elderly population do not suffer from this damaging and ill-thought-out proposal. And we in these benches add our voice to, it would appear, an ever-growing number of people on all sides of this House, and the length and breadth of these islands, and calling for the Government to reverse their decision. And to end this abdication of responsibility that they are putting onto the BBC, particularly at this time of rising pensioner poverty. And I wholeheartedly agree with the Right Honourable Member for Wantage and the Member for the City of Chester when they said the Government was completely wrong to impose this deal on the BBC in the first place, and then to actually criticise the BBC for doing what they were instructed to do simply beggars belief. Therefore, at a time when more and more of our older people, many as a direct result of Tory austerity cuts, are struggling to make ends meet, it would be a grave injustice to remove the TV licence fee and expect them to conjure up another £150 from somewhere. Recently, Scotland's First Minister signed a letter to the Prime Minister urging the UK Government to guarantee that free TV licences for over 75s would be protected. That letter was signed by every leader of Scotland's major political parties, with the exception of Ruth Davidson of the Scottish Conservatives. And the reason that Scotland's First Minister and the other leaders signed that was because they know that the UK Government already provides one of the lowest state pensions in the developed world, and our older people need more financial support, not less, particularly at a time of rising costs. As we've heard Dame Cheryl, following their consultation process, the BBC announced that from June 2020, only those people who are aged 75 and above and who are in receipt of pension credit will continue to receive the free TV licences. However, I would argue very strongly that the means testing, the basis on which pension credit has been shown, is fundamentally flawed. And I do take issue with the Corporation's Director General, Tony Hall, and its Chairman, Sir David Clementi's assertion that using pension credit means that those pensioners in most need will be protected, because that's simply not the case. It's currently estimated that 4 in 10 households, 40% of pensioner households who are eligible for pension credit, do not receive it for one reason or another. Indeed, just last month, the charity Independent Age found that more than 1 million pensioner households across the UK are living in poverty because the government failed to act upon unpaid pension credits. And that since 2017, the government has actually benefited from £7 billion of unclaimed pension credit. And as a result, there will be hundreds of thousands of poor pensioners who would qualify but don't, and who will now have to find an extra £150 to pay for a TV licences. But as we've also heard, what about those pensioners who just miss out on qualifying for pension credit? They are hardly living the life of Riley, and they could, by no stretch of the imagination, be considered wealthy. Yet it is they who will be hurt most by this decision. So perhaps Lord Hall and Sir David Clementi would care to reflect on what they have argued is the fairness and the protection that is afforded to this group of people. Because after years of Tory austerity and the deep financial uncertainty caused by Brexit, the last thing our older people need is the extra burden of finding the money for a TV licence. I would commend the words of the Honourable Member for Portsmouth South and for Swansea East and for Lincoln, because I think what they said, you know, the testimonies they gave from their constituents, they could have come from any one of the 650 constituencies across these islands, because that is the reality, and they display the depth of feeling among our constituents. Dame Cheryl, in Scotland, it's estimated that the cost of this Tory TV licence fee is going to cost £40 million, with $250,000 over 75s set to lose out. Age Scotland also estimate that around 76,000 pensioners in Scotland do not receive pension credit, even though they are eligible for it. And we in the SNP wholeheartedly agree with BECTU, the broadcasting trade union, who said that the over 75s licence is a welfare benefit, and it is a government's responsibility to pay it, no one else's. And like BECTU and others, we on these benches will continue to call out this government and its shameful subcontracting of its welfare responsibility to the BBC. Dame Cheryl, stripping pensioners of their free TV licences is unacceptable. It will add pressure on already stretched pensioners' budgets and will cause worry and angst among our poorest and most vulnerable people, who will be, in turn, forced to make difficult choices about what they can and cannot afford. The responsibility for the TV licence lies with the UK government. Welfare policy, as we have heard so often, should not be decided by the BBC, and we strongly urge the government to recognise that it is their responsibility, and the responsibility that they have to our older population to fully fund these licences. I will finish, Dave Cheryl, by going right back to the beginning to the Honourable Member for Warrington. And I think the words that she said really resonate. I think it's something the government should reflect on when she said that what they are doing to the over 75s really is the most mean-spirited of government cuts.
Kevin Brennan.
Well, thank you very much, Dame Cheryl, and thank you to everybody who's spoken in today's debate. I'm not sure my microphone's on, is it? Working? I can beat the microphone, I don't need it. But thank you. It wasn't showing, that's all. But thank you very much for everyone who's participated in the debate. And can I also join those who congratulated the my honourable friend, the member for Warrington North, who again gave an object lesson in how to open a debate and how to deliver a parliamentary speech with her customary lucidity and gusto, and with great facts backing up her case. And I think she's a wonderful chair of the Petitions Committee, and long may she be able to introduce these debates on our behalf and set the tone so well. There was something she said I disagreed with. However, she said that she thought that this government was the Arthur Daly of public administration. I think that's very unfair on Del Boy, because I can't imagine he would have for one moment tried to pull off a scam like the over 75s scam that the government has been trying to pull off by outsourcing social policy in this way. And she also pointed out the extra costs that older people face, which I thought was a new and original point in the debate in relation to extra heating and so on, that isn't often taken into account when discussing the importance of free television licences for the over 75s. And also, I think quite rightly, and people should take note of it, predicted that the scammers and the con men and the fraudsters will soon be moving in on vulnerable young people, older people, when the TV licences for over 75s are ended, if indeed the government doesn't reverse this very poor decision. The honourable gentleman, the member for Henley, revealed a new and interesting fact. We hadn't known before that he once had been part of the BBC's talent in years gone by, and that he was once big in India, which I thought was something that I hadn't anticipated being the case. But on the substance of what he said, he seemed to be suggesting perhaps that advertising should be used more widely in the BBC as a model for its funding, and I'm afraid that's something that on this side of the House, anyway, we disagree with. My honourable friend, the member for Portsmouth South, quite rightly pointed out that this over 75s free TV licence was a social policy, and that if the government wanted to change the social policy, then it should have the guts and the commitment to do so itself, to make the argument itself, to put it in its manifesto itself, rather than put in the opposite in its manifesto, to argue the case in Parliament itself, to take it to a vote here, to do the consultation with the public, to do all the things that every government should do when it's changing social policy, not taking the executives from the BBC into a darkened room with a rubber hose and duffing them up until they agreed to do this under the threat of Treasury cuts to the future BBC funding. And even having done that, which was wrong in itself, subsequently then to put into their manifesto for government in the 2017 general election the proposition that this would be retained, the free concession, when they had outsourced it already to the BBC, really is an example of the most egregious misuse of a manifesto at a general election. It's no wonder it went down like a lead balloon at that general election, their manifesto. Now, the Right Honourable Member for Wantage, who is unfortunately not in his place, but who is a distinguished former minister in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, I think rightly referred to the wider work that the BBC does in our cultural and social life. And to many of the things that he added, I'd also add podcasts, which I think are becoming more and more important. I just listened to a brilliant podcast about the so-called case of the Cardiff 3 and the Lynette White murder in Cardiff, called Shreds. I recommend it to members and right honourable members as a fine example of public service broadcasting, as we used to call it, in this case public service streaming, I suppose, or downloading. But really there's now some brilliant content that is being made available to the public and to licence fee payers in a way that is new and innovative by the BBC. And he also said, quite clearly, and I think quite straightforwardly, should reform of over 75s free TV licences be the BBC's role? The answer is no. And I say to the Minister, the former Minister made that absolutely clear. He was even a member of the department when this decision was being taken. But he's absolutely clear that this shouldn't be a role played by the BBC, and that's her right honourable friend making that statement. My honourable friend, the member for Swansea East, who also, unfortunately, is not in her place, mentioned her own 89-year-old mother, and indeed I have an 89-year-old mother who also relies on her television licence, but she pointed out the amount of pension credit that remain unclaimed in her constituency of Swansea East, and it is one of the more deprived parts of the country, £6.5 million of unclaimed pension credit, which raises the question, what will happen if, in fact, pension credit is, as we all hope it would be, is claimed by a greater proportion of the population than currently? The government might find itself, as a result of this policy, with more people claiming pension credit. That would be a good thing, and it would have to pay for it. But by the same token, it would also mean an extra burden on the BBC in relation to offering free TV licences, if that were to happen. And I put down a written question to the government to ask them what estimate they made of that effect, and the answer is none whatsoever. It could be as if Dame Cheryl, they're making it up on the back of a fag packet as they go along. The honourable member for Stoke-on-Trent South described the TV licence as archaic. I would simply say to him, there are sometimes things in life that, and he obviously has read and swallowed some books on market economics along the way, but there are some things in life that actually are the opposite to the usual rule. They work in practice, but not in theory. And that is the case with the TV licence. It works in practice. It has broad public support, as clearly evidenced in the statistics. It doesn't work in any economic theory textbook, but then so what? It actually is something that works very well and very effectively. The honourable member for Lincoln, my honourable friend, who unfortunately isn't here either at the moment for the wind-ups, told us about the positive response there had been to the petition in her constituency. The Honourable gentleman for Bexhill and Battle, who does a lot of work in this place around issues affecting the BBC, described it as a much-loved anomaly. And I think in some ways he's echoing some of the sentiments that I would like to say from the front bench on this side of the House. But he also admitted the BBC had not really been funded to pay for the free television licence concession, and that the commitment in the government's manifesto up until 2022 should be honoured. My honourable friend, the member for Newport East, also very importantly mentioned the impact this could have on people with dementia. And the honourable member for Cleethorpes said that it was inevitable, I think I'm quoting him directly here, it was inevitable that the BBC would opt out at the first opportunity. That's what he said. Now, the government is trying to maintain the fiction that the government didn't need to opt out at the first opportunity, and that really the government, really the BBC should be continuing to run this concession despite the fact the funding hasn't been supplied. And my honourable friend from the City of Chester pointed out that the outsourcing of blame is a speciality of this government, and this is a very fine example of it. And I think he made a very important point that talent shouldn't just be used to refer to on-air employees of the BBC. As we like to say on this side, talent is everywhere. Yeah. Opportunity isn't. And we are here to try and extend that opportunity much more widely than it currently is. My friend, the honourable member for Norwich South, quoted Cardiff University. I have to accept that, obviously, being from Cardiff, at its face value as being a very good piece of research. And what I would say to him, and he made some points about BBC bias and so on, but I would say to him is that the BBC is still the most trusted source of news amongst the public. And it also is subject to Ofcom regulation, has to meet standards. So imperfect as it is, and I know he accepts this point, and he's right that we should hold it to account, imperfect as it is, I still think that it plays a role in maintaining the gravitational pull of standards in our broadcasting in this country that is rarely matched in other parts of the Western world. The honourable member for Coatbridge, Christon and Bells Hill, I think we all give him our sympathies for the loss of his mother, and he appealed to the Prime Minister, even at this late stage, to act on this matter. And the last two speakers, the member for Blackley and Brompton, I would just say to him that he shouldn't always put everybody in the same category from Oxbridge. There are working-class Oxbridge graduates, and I would include myself in that, and as well as the final speaker, the honourable member for Keighley, who also was there at the same time as me, who came from a working-class background and perhaps broke through that typical mould that he was describing in his comments. But as usual, the honourable member for Keighley also talked a lot of sense about the future of the BBC. I'd just like to briefly say, Dame Cheryl, that the BBC is under attack from a number of different directions at the moment. And I think it's very sad that the government is joining that attack in relation to the over 75s licence fee issue, and joining the predictable attacks that come from some sections of the tabloid press, often owned, as my honourable member for Norwich said, by a small number of individuals. And I think the government should do more to stand up for the BBC, to support it, and not to try to outsource its responsibilities to our national broadcaster. As Joni Mitchell once said, Dame Cheryl, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. We should cherish the BBC as a uniquely British institution that works very effectively. Yes, hold it to account. Yes, let's try to improve it, but let's not use it as a whipping boy because of the government's own failure in relation to its social policies. And I would finally say, James Sherrill, that on the issue of the over 75s licence fee, the government's handling of it is a disgrace. And I think now is the time, now is an opportunity with a change of leadership, perhaps for a change of mind.
Minister Margot James.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Dame Cheryl. And I would like to congratulate the honourable member for Warrington North for securing this very important debate on these three petitions, and express my agreement with the Shadow Minister that her opening speech was indeed an excellent account of so many of the issues driving the petitions and her own response to them. Before I address some of the issues that have been raised, I do want to echo the huge positivity around this room, across the chamber, about the role and importance and value of the BBC. I think we are extremely fortunate in this country to have the BBC for all the reasons that honourable members have put forward here today. They deliver an enormous public service, hugely successful productions like The Bodyguard, Strictly, the Today programme, and I would add a very recent one, Gentleman Jack, which absolutely fantastic. I'm glad my honourable friend loved it. And it was a sort of series that illustrates the importance of diversity in the BBC. It's a regional series set in Halifax, written by a BAFTA-winning director and playwright, Sally Wainwright, also from Yorkshire. And it's a co-production between BBC Studios and Lookout Point. And I wish that such a series had been aired when I was growing up in the 1970s. And it's the licence fee, which of course delivers this public value, and it's the licence fee which allows the BBC to reach UK audiences everywhere, from the TVs in our homes to all the gadgets and devices that we carry around with us, and also the requirement to represent and cater for all sorts of niche interests which may well not attract the attention of a channel that depends upon advertising or even broad-based subscription revenues for its identity and position. So the BBC received close to £3.7 billion in licence fee income last year, and its unique position in providing distinctive content in underserved genres to underserved audiences is absolutely vital. On the question of the licence fee, honourable members will know that we carefully considered, as part of the BBC Charter Review process in 2015 and 16, and that the licence fee, we found, independent research demonstrated a great deal of public interest, and 60% of the people surveyed backed the licence fee as the least worst option. I think my right honourable friend from Wantage mentioned, but as the mode of payment that they most supported, 60%, and fewer than 3% backed either an advertising model or a subscription-based model. And I think those figures are quite powerful. That's why we've committed to maintain the licence fee funding model for at least the duration of this new 11-year charter period, which will bring us to the end of 2027. It provides the BBC with the funding certainty that it needs to thrive and deliver its mission and public purposes. The media landscape is changing all the time, and there is more choice than ever before for citizens and consumers, particularly in the form of subscription-based services. However, the BBC's content remains hugely popular. 91% of adults in the UK use its services each week, spending an average of 18 hours watching, listening to, or using BBC services. And these figures demonstrate the continuing importance of the BBC in the very fast-changing and increasingly competitive media landscape. And in addition, the BBC directly invests over £2 billion into the UK creative industries each year, and it invests billions of pounds in the digital and high-tech industries which support content creation and distribution. And so it is therefore a very important contributor not only to our shared experiences and public life, but also to the economy. I move now to the issue of the over 75 licence fee concession. The government recognises, of course, the importance of television to people of all ages, and particularly for older people. And we have heard a lot today from people who have talked to their constituents and have recounted what we all know, which is that the television can provide a lifeline to older people, particularly if they're recently bereaved or live alone, as a way of staying connected with the world. Honourable members have made this point very clear, and I wholeheartedly agree with those sentiments. But in the 2015 funding settlement, and I think if we cast our minds back 4 or 5 years to that time, there was an expectation by the government that all public services and public institutions had to find some economies, had to play their part in reducing the budget deficit overall and bringing some stability to the public finances. And I think older people, as well as everybody else, mostly agreed with the need to do that, although they didn't necessarily agree with all the means that were identified as the route forward to restore some stability to the public finances and some sense to them. But it was agreed with the BBC that the responsibility for that concession would transfer to the BBC by June 2020. And in return for that, the government closed the iPlayer loophole so that more people paid the licence fee, and many, many more people now pay the licence fee, leading to an uptick in the revenues for the BBC. And also, the government committed to increase the licence fee in line with inflation during the charter period, which gave the BBC, for the first time, more of a sustainable income for the future. And at the time, the government and the BBC agreed that this was a fair deal. Indeed, the Director-General said at the time that the government's decision to put the cost of the over 75s upon us has been more than matched by the deal coming back for the BBC. And the other point I would make is that Parliament debated the issue extensively when it passed the Digital Economy Act in 2017 and approved transferring legal responsibility for the concession to the BBC. And I was a whip in that government, and I can tell honourable members, and Dame Cheryl, I'm sure you will remember as well, that we had a number of very contentious issues which we had to compromise greatly upon. But this was not one of them. Well, it wasn't something that we had, because the honourable member might remember, I will take his intervention without him having to make it if he likes. He's okay.
That's absolutely, in fairness, Danger, I'm not going to let the Minister get away with that. It's absolute rubbish. We put down extensive amendments at committee and at report stage and opposed it throughout. It was a highly contentious matter.
I think, to be fair to the honourable member, I think he has a fair point that it was contentious, but it got through without the government having to make compromises upon it, which many other things, like, for example, honourable members might remember the proposals to change Sunday trading laws. That's one of several examples of legislation that the government actually had to change because opposition was so great. This does not attract the same level of opposition. It got through. Enough honourable members voted it through, and I do think Parliament therefore approved it, which is something we do have to bear in mind. And it is therefore a responsibility that was passed to the BBC with parliamentary approval, and indeed it was accepted by the BBC governors and the Director-General no less. And so the government passed that responsibility over, and I now turn to the issue of perceived bias in the BBC, although I'm willing to take more interventions on the other points that I've answered up until now. But under its Royal Charter, the BBC has a duty to deliver high-quality, impartial and accurate news content. Honourable members have already mentioned the point that 90% of public opinion values the news coverage of the BBC and believes in its impartiality. And as with all other broadcasters, the BBC is subject to the Ofcom Broadcasting Code, which includes requirements on accuracy and impartiality. And Ofcom is now firmly established as the new external regulator for the BBC and will act to safeguard the high standards of impartiality that I believe already exist at the BBC. So the government is clear that the licensing fee is the right funding model. It is clear that Ofcom's robust approach to regulation will safeguard the impartiality which the BBC has a duty to observe. And the licence fee concession was passed over. I do not, therefore, stand and criticise the BBC for making the decision that it did, having had the responsibility put on it and it accepted it. I do think that we should now let the BBC get on and deliver at least a free licence to the people aged over 75 who qualify for pension credit. And I take the point made by the Shadow Minister that given the fact that the BBC are now going to write to all people in receipt of a free television licence with the new rules, setting out how they can apply, I am hopeful that indeed this decision will actually rectify to a certain extent the underclaiming of pension credit. Those 37% of people over the age of 75 who are entitled to pension credit will now have another incentive to claim it.
Helen Jones to wind up. Thank you.
Cheryl, this has been a very interesting debate, and I'd like to thank all those members who have spoken on these various petitions we've had today. There have been some extremely interesting points made, but time does not allow me to go through them today. I would, however, like to thank the Minister for her sterling defence of the licence fee, and in particular point out to her that I doubt if that excellent programme, Gentleman Jack, would ever have been made by a commercial broadcaster. Yes. A pitch for a programme about gay women in early 19th century Yorkshire would never have got beyond first base. It is an excellent programme. However, I am sorry to hear her not responding, and in fact she probably cannot respond, to the real concern that has been expressed here about pensioners who will lose their free TV licence. This is something that needs to be taken up higher in government, in the Treasury, and we need to ensure that our pensioners are protected. We certainly opposed that change at the time. I know that other honourable members did. We have to admit that the current situation doesn't work, that the BBC shouldn't be deciding social policy at all, and change the system to protect our pensioners.
Yeah. The question is that this House has considered e-petitions 234627, 234797 and 235653 relating to the BBC. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended.